something ancient went wrong in the dark. Shadows moved where the gods were supposed to speak, and entire civilizations wrote about nights when the world suddenly felt inhabited. Down here, in ruined chambers and forgotten tablets, you don't find monsters, you find patterns. Whispered names no ritual could bind, symbols that appear in places no culture ever touched, and stories of beings that stepped through thresholds nobody admits to building. In this documentary, we're going to explore 101 of these unsolved mysteries, what people across continents claim to see, fear and survive, and why these accounts matter more than we think today. Because once you compare them side by side, something strange begins to emerge. But there's one mystery in this world of demons that refuses to fit into any belief, any culture, or any explanation, and it changes everything we think we know about ancient darkness. The earliest descriptions of ancient demonology rarely begin with monstrous forms or gruesome rituals. Instead, they begin with silence, an absence so profound that the cultures experiencing it treated it as an event. As you move through this first section, you'll notice how the theme of sudden divine quiet opens the entire landscape of unsolved mysteries, because what followed that quiet shaped centuries of speculation, fear, and ritual innovation. And although historians document political, environmental, and social causes that could explain such interruptions, the surviving tablets suggest something stranger was happening, moments when familiar divine communication simply stopped, and something unfamiliar seemed to fill the void. You'll see the first major fact in this block appear almost immediately as scholars examine the records of Ugarit. Those ritual texts describe a night when the gods went silent, a cessation of expected oracular and divinatory signs. Historians working on these tablets point out that such interruptions were unusual enough to be recorded with precision, which helps you grasp why the scribes considered it remarkable. The priests who noted the event did not describe confusion or doubt, they described a rupture in the normal order, as if communication between the human and the divine systems had fractured without warning. But the second key element surfaces when you compare those accounts with Babylonian laments that associate divine silence with hostile presences. Here the narrative pivots, because although some scholars interpret these laments as literary metaphors, others note the consistency with which malevolent spirits appear in moments of ritual breakdown. This parallel creates tension. If the silence was simply political disruption, why would so many ritual documents link it to intrusive forces? Yet if it were truly supernatural, why do the tablets offer no unified vocabulary or explanation for the phenomenon? This is where the mystery deepens, through the mismatch between what was recorded and what can be confidently explained. Even so, if those two elements told the whole story, you might conclude they were regional fears or poetically exaggerated crises. But the third detail destabilizes that assumption, because Hittite ritual texts also mention unexpected presences during pauses in ceremony. You'll notice how this adds weight. Multiple cultures, each with distinct pantheons and ritual structures, independently describe the same pattern. Hittite priests were known for detailed liturgical documentation, and when they paused a ritual, whether due to omen, error, or interruption, they often wrote that uninvited entities appeared or were suspected to be near. This isn't the language of theatrical symbolism, it's the language of practitioners describing anomalies within a system they normally controlled tightly. And when you consider their obsessive concern with ritual precision, these statements feel less like storytelling and more like attempts to account for episodes they struggled to categorize. However, the fourth and final fact in this block complicates everything further, because scholars today cannot agree whether these ancient descriptions reference an actual perceived threat or simply reflect the anxieties of collapsing kingdoms. Ritual silence could certainly arise from political instability, especially in periods of invasion or famine. Some historians argue that the laments and ritual manuals reflect metaphorical expressions of collective fear, yet other specialists counter that the recurrence of similar motifs Silence, intrusion, presence across so many regions suggests a genuine pattern in how ancient people interpreted breaks in the divine-human communication chain. This disagreement is not just academic, it shapes how you interpret every later mystery of demonology, because it determines whether early demon beliefs emerged from metaphors or encounters. As you look closer, you'll realize how each thread in this section reinforces the tension between what is historically documented and what remains unexplained. The Ugaritic scribes weren't meeting to philosophize, they were performing rituals central to political and agricultural stability. Silence in that context wasn't poetic, it was alarming. Likewise, Babylonian lamentations were structured responses to crisis, meant to re-establish cosmic order. When those laments shift from pleading with absent gods to warning about encroaching spirits, it indicates a change in perceived threat, not simply a literary flourish. Hittite ritualists, for their part, were technicians of the sacred. Their tablets show diagrams, sequences, and precise invocations. When such a system registers uninvited presences, you're looking at practitioners noting a disruption they could not absorb into the standard framework. What emerges from all of this isn't a single explanation, but an unresolved question. Why did so many ancient cultures treat silence as a sign of intrusion rather than absence? You might think silence would be interpreted as withdrawal, but that's not what the tablets show. Instead, silence was seen as an opening, an empty channel into which something could enter. And across these three regions, Ugarit, Babylon and Hatti, the entities that seemed to move into that opening were not depicted as gods, ancestors, or friendly spirits. They were nameless or hostile, undefined or malevolent, always belonging to a category outside the understood divine order. This suggests a deeper pattern. Demonology often begins where divine structure fails, not as an opposite system, but as a consequence of its breakdown. When the gods stop speaking, something else speaks, not clearly, not predictably, but persistently enough for multiple civilizations to document it. And this is where your exploration begins, because the silence itself becomes the first threshold. It represents the moment when priestly authority weakens, ritual boundaries thin, and interpretable signs dissolve. In that gap, the unknown enters the record for the first time. As you move through the remaining sections, keep this dynamic in mind. Demonologies arise not just from fear, but from the need to explain interruptions in cosmic order. These early texts show a world in which every ritual, sign and omen formed part of an interdependent system. When that system faltered, ancient observers had to create new categories to account for what they believed was happening. The concept of demons as forces outside divine sanction may well have been shaped more by these moments of rupture than by any single myth. And that realization prepares you for the mysteries ahead. Because if silence created the first breach, what lies beyond are the entities believed to guard the edges of that breach, beings neither welcomed nor fully understood. And that tension is exactly what opens the door to the next section. Across the ancient world, the idea of thresholds carried a weight far greater than simple architecture. You'll notice how cultures treated doorways, gates, and boundary stones not merely as functional structures, but as vulnerable points where the order of a household, a temple, or an entire city could be breached. And what makes this section especially compelling is that the beings associated with these liminal spaces never fit neatly into the pantheons around them. Instead, they appear as guardians of passages no human claimed to have built or fully understood, gatekeepers whose presence suggests that ancient demonology may have grown out of humanity's fear of what waits on the other side of the crossing. The first major element in this block becomes clear when you read Akkadian text describing a category of spirits stationed at thresholds. Scribes didn't present them as ordinary protective deities. They stood between the sacred and the profane, between the inside and the outside. Their names appear in exorcistic and apotropaic contexts, but their placement is always the same, by the door, neither invited fully in nor expelled completely. Scholars highlight how consistent this pattern is across tablets, reinforcing the idea that doorways were conceptualized as contested spaces, locations where human and supernatural boundaries blur, and this is where the first mystery deepens. These guardians didn't serve a clear god, cult, or temple. They protected something far older than the brick or cedar frames built around them. If that initial pattern stood alone, you might assume it's a simple metaphysical metaphor. But a second detail complicates it. Excavations in temples across Mesopotamia and the Levant reveal door frames decorated with apotropaic figures that don't match the local pantheon. Archaeologists have noted how some temples in these regions show iconography of spirits unrelated to the gods the worshippers honored inside. You begin to understand how unusual this is when you consider how carefully ancient religious spaces were curated. Foreign spirit images would not be added casually, especially in the most symbolically charged parts of the structure, yet they appear consistently in temple thresholds, carved or molded into clay plaques. It raises the question, were these communities acknowledging forces they didn't control but needed to appease? The third key development unfolds when scholars examine the famous dynamic between Pazuzu and Lamashtu, two figures whose roles reveal the logic of forbidden thresholds. Pazuzu is often invoked not to worship but to repel Lamashtu, a demoness associated with childbirth dangers. Their opposition suggests a type of cosmological gatekeeping, where one being restrains another. Although not every detail of their relationship is fully understood, it becomes clear that both are linked with liminal states, especially the boundary between life and death in childbirth, one of the most fragile thresholds in ancient thought. What adds further intrigue is that ritual texts sometimes place their images near doors, as if the boundary of a home needed a defender against forces lying just beyond it. Yet neither Pazuzu nor Lamashtu fits comfortably into any divine hierarchy, making their placement feel more like a negotiation than a devotion. Even if that were the end of the pattern, the idea of thresholds as supernatural gateways would already be strong. But the fourth detail makes you question the entire spatial logic of the ancient world. Egyptian funerary texts describe underworld guides appearing near portals placed in parts of tombs that don't align with the expected geography of the afterlife. You would expect these guardians near symbolic entrances to the Duat, yet some appear in niches or architectural recesses with no obvious ritual purpose. Egyptologists debate whether these placements reflect older traditions, symbolic reconfigurations, or a deeper belief that gateways manifest in physical spaces regardless of planned design. And if gateways could appear unpredictably, then the entities guarding them might be responding to something not visible to human architects. A final element in this chain reinforces the unsettling coherence across cultures. When you compare threshold imagery across Akkadian, Levantine, and Egyptian contexts, similarities emerge in posture, hybrid form, and positioning, similarities striking enough that researchers still debate whether they represent a shared ancient belief in invisible passages. These parallels persist even when the cultures had minimal direct contact. You begin to see how this raises questions larger than diffusion or coincidence. It suggests that across the ancient world, people repeatedly recognized certain spaces as vulnerable points in the boundary between worlds and placed certain beings there to manage the risk. As you move deeper into this section, what stands out is not the presence of demons, but the consistency of the architecture surrounding them. These beings seem to form a category of their own, entities neither worshipped nor fully rejected, allowed to exist only because the alternative was more dangerous. In a sense, the human-built threshold was an acknowledgement of another kind of threshold behind it, an invisible division that people believed needed constant supervision. When you examine the ritual literature, this becomes clearer. Many incantations direct the practitioner to address the doorway itself, implying the structure has an active role in regulating the energies around it, and the beings placed there, carved, invoked, or buried, were treated as specialists mediating between human and non-human forces. You also see how these beliefs affected everyday life. Some households placed clay figures beneath doorsteps, hidden from sight, but believed to intercept malignant spirits entering from the street. Others instructed a priest to cleanse a threshold after illness or death, suggesting that the boundary could absorb or transmit unseen forces. In royal structures, thresholds were even more heavily fortified, sometimes with multiple layers of spirit imagery. Kings understood that political power rested on stable boundaries, and any place where those boundaries thinned required supernatural reinforcement. It's here that you sense how political stability and spiritual architecture intertwined. Rulers trusted these gatekeepers more than walls alone. Scholars studying these patterns acknowledge how difficult it is to build a unified theory. Were these beings true demons, or were they misunderstood protectors standing between worlds? Even their classification remains elusive. Some appear malevolent, others benevolent, many simply indifferent. But what unites them is their placement at the borders of human space. And regardless of their motives, ancient people clearly believed they controlled access to realms or forces that must not spill into daily life. The idea grows even more complex when you consider that no surviving tradition claims ownership of all these threshold spirits. Temples claimed gods, cults claimed deities, kings claimed legitimacy, but no group claimed these gatekeepers as theirs. They are, in a sense, the unaligned forces of ancient religion, necessary yet unclaimed, powerful yet obscure, feared but relied upon. And because no single tradition regulates them, they drift across cultures with similar forms and roles, suggesting that the belief in forbidden gateways was not tied to particular pantheons, but to the universality of human anxiety about what lies just beyond our field of perception. This leads you to a broader realization. Demonology did not only explain what threatened humanity, but also what humanity could not map. Thresholds are places of transition, and transitions are moments of vulnerability. The beings who guard them occupy the unstable middle ground between the known and the unknown. And as you step further into this archive of mysteries, you begin to see them as the earliest manifestations of a concept that will return again and again. The idea that access points between worlds must be guarded because something waits on the other side. That insight is exactly what prepares you for what comes next, as the exploration shifts from gateways no one claimed to build toward names no ritual could ever bind. When you turn from thresholds to the name spoken around them, the entire landscape of ancient demonology shifts once again. The further you look into the archives, the clearer it becomes that names were never simple labels. They were instruments, tools meant to fix an entity in place, define its range, and give ritualists control. And yet, in spite of the immense attention ancient cultures gave to classification, pronunciation, and etymological precision, some names simply refuse to behave the way a name should. This is where the third section begins to widen the mystery, not with monstrous appearances, but with linguistic fragments that disrupt everything we know about how these cultures thought the supernatural could be managed. What first captures your attention is the way some Mesopotamian tablets preserve references to spirits whose names survive only in shattered syllables. Scholars reconstruct what they can, fragments of phonemes, traces of determinatives, but the results never settle into complete forms. You'll notice that this isn't the usual kind of textual damage. Many broken tablets preserve enough structure to infer the entire missing term, yet these particular names resist every attempt at reconstruction. It's as if the scribes themselves struggled to capture the sounds, or perhaps recorded them reluctantly. And when you compare these cases with more complete demon lists, the contrast becomes striking. The spirits that fit neatly into ritual control are fully named, while the ones associated with disruption or danger appear in jagged pieces. The brokenness becomes part of the mystery, the first clue that some beings were thought to exist outside the linguistic order that humans relied on to assert dominance. As you begin to connect this detail with the broader ritual system, something else surfaces. Exorcistic manuals throughout Mesopotamia and the Levant warn of spirits that cannot be bound by name. beings described as slipping away from the firm structures that other demons obey. These texts imply that a name should grant control, but in certain cases, even when the name is pronounced correctly, the entity does not respond the way ritual theory predicts. Scholars debate whether this reflects failed practice, deliberately coded language, or the existence of taboo terms concealed behind euphemisms. Yet the consistency across ritual schools complicates any simple explanation. Different regions, different centuries, different priestly lineages all preserve the idea that some spirits lie beyond the reach of linguistic binding. When you consider the centrality of language in ancient magic, the anomaly becomes more than a detail, it becomes a challenge to the entire system. If the phenomenon were limited to Mesopotamia, you might attribute it to a regional set of taboos or scribal traditions. But the third thread in this web emerges from Greek literature, where certain daemons bear names that break expected morphological patterns. Their endings don't align with typical divine or heroic naming structures, and grammarians have puzzled for generations over why these exceptions exist. Some argue that the anomalies reflect archaic forms predating classical Greek. Others point to potential foreign influence, but the most provocative theory among philologists considers whether these irregularities were intentional, signals that the beings in question resisted ordinary categorization. When a name refuses to follow the patterns of its language, it stands apart, destabilizing the very assumptions that allow the rest of the pantheon to be organized. It's here, in the gaps of grammar, that another facet of the mystery appears. Perhaps these entities were believed to originate from outside the cultural system altogether. Even more intriguing is the way Achaemenid inscriptions treat the Daivas, using terms that imply unspeakability or forbidden utterance. The language is precise. The texts do not merely condemn these beings, but imply that pronouncing their names carries consequences. The idea that a name itself could be dangerous transforms your understanding of the ancient mindset. While many traditions treat divine names as powerful tools for healing, blessing, or invocation, these inscriptions invert the logic. They present a class of beings whose names should not be said, whose identity destabilizes the boundaries that ritual specialists work to maintain. The paradox is unmistakable. Names are supposed to provide structure, yet here the name is itself a threat. And if that paradox were easier to explain, the story might settle here. But the final thread in this block complicates everything, because scholars still cannot agree whether these unspeakable or unbindable names represent lost linguistic knowledge, deliberately obscured terms, or ritual taboos rooted in cosmological fear. Some philologists believe the mystery reflects nothing more than the erosion of data, broken tablets, incomplete sources, forgotten dialects. Others argue that these patterns reveal deeper cultural anxieties about classification. Ancient demonology depends on categorization, hierarchy, and precision. Anything that resists those structures poses a threat, not just spiritually and intellectually. And so the debate continues. Are these names fragmented because time destroyed them, or because the cultures that preserved them considered fragmentation an essential part of their power? As you explore this tension, it becomes clear that names in ancient demonology served a purpose beyond identification. They created a boundary, a conceptual threshold, much like the physical ones in the previous section. To name a being was to place it within a system, to fix it in the cosmological map. And when a being refused to be named, or when its name broke the rules of language, the system trembled. That trembling echoes through the surviving literature, revealing how fragile the linguistic structures around demonology truly were. You begin to see how these linguistic fractures map onto broader ritual concerns. When an exorcist names a spirit correctly, the ritual can proceed with confidence. The being is located, defined, made legible. But when the exorcist encounters a spirit whose name resists classification, uncertainty enters the ritual space. Instructions become tentative. If the name cannot be spoken, or if the name is not known, the ritual moves into contingency procedures. This uncertainty appears in multiple regions, suggesting a universal fear that some entities simply exist outside the logical framework humans use to interpret the supernatural. The more you study these cases, the more apparent it becomes that the mystery is not simply about missing data. Instead, it reveals a conceptual frontier, an edge where language fails and something unclassifiable appears. The ancients recognized that power lies in naming. They also recognized that danger lies where naming collapses. A spirit without a stable name cannot be invoked, dismissed, catalogued, or sealed. It occupies a position entirely outside the ritual economy of control, and that position makes such beings uniquely threatening. Throughout the ancient world, philosophies of language assumed a connection between sound and essence. A name was believed to contain part of the entity's identity, to encode aspects of its nature. When names defied reconstruction or avoided stable form, ancient scholars confronted the possibility that some entities lacked fixed identity altogether, or that their identity shifted in ways language could not contain. This idea haunts the literature. It suggests that some beings belong to a category beyond mortality, divinity. You also notice how these anomalies influence later demonological systems. Medieval grimoires, though far removed from the ancient world, inherit the idea of demons with unstable or forbidden names. Some spirits in these texts are described as giving different names to different practitioners, or refusing to identify themselves. The echoes are unmistakable. The ancient anxiety about naming carries across millennia, even in cultures that no longer speak the languages of the original tablets. The idea persists that a name too dangerous to utter, or too unstable to record, signifies a deeper threat. As you reflect on all of this, the narrative begins to shift subtly toward a larger implication. Thresholds can be guarded by physical guardians, but linguistic thresholds, boundaries of meaning and identity, require their own defenses. The ancients understood that naming was a kind of gatekeeping, and that beings whose names escaped that gatekeeping represented cracks in the cosmological architecture. Whether those cracks were intentional, accidental, or metaphysical remains unknown, but they form one of the most persistent mysteries in the demonological tradition. And with that recognition, the path forward becomes clear. Because if some beings could slip past the constraints of language, the next mystery asks whether their forms existed long before writing itself could attempt to capture them, long before clay tablets recorded incantations and ritual formulas, long before scribes carved the names of spirits into orderly lists. Ancient hands were already shaping images whose meaning would ripple into demonologies thousands of years later. As you step into this section, you'll notice how the timeline bends. Instead of starting with written systems of belief, you encounter carvings made by cultures that possessed no writing at all. And yet, these carvings display beings and configurations that later civilizations would describe with uncanny familiarity. This is where the mystery deepens, not because we lack data, but because the data we do possess refuses to align neatly with historical sequence. The carvings come first, the demonologies come later, and the resemblance between them raises a question that no scholar has been able to answer fully. What appears at the heart of this puzzle is the simple fact that Neolithic ateliers sites, dated thousands of years before the first cuneiform signs, contain carved images of hybrid beings. You'll notice immediately how these creatures combine animal and human traits in ways reminiscent of later apotropaic figures. Some display claws paired with upright posture. Others merge the heads of birds or felines with torsos that seem strangely anatomical for such early workmanship. Archaeologists emphasize how unusual this precision is for the period. The carvings show not simply animals, but composite beings presented with deliberate emphasis on eyes, teeth, wings, or talons. These motifs surface again in the demon catalogues of Mesopotamia, where beings like the Udughul or the Galu bear similarly hybrid traits. Yet no direct cultural line connects the Neolithic artisans to the scribal traditions that flourished millennia later. The gap is too wide for simple inheritance, And so the first element of the mystery appears. Why do creatures carved long before writing resemble the supernatural beings documented after writing emerges? But as striking as the early carvings are on their own, the puzzle expands dramatically when you look at sites like Göbekli Tepe. The massive stone pillars erected there, arranged in circular enclosures, display animals positioned in patterns that suggest more than mere decoration. Foxes, snakes, vultures, and boars appear in compositions that scholars still struggle to interpret. You'll notice how many of these animals also appear in later demonological texts as symbols of danger, guardianship, or liminality. The vultures in particular carry weight because in both Anatolian and Mesopotamian traditions they hover near thresholds of death, connecting the living to the bodies of the dead. In Göbekli Tepe, vultures appear carved in aggressive or alert stances, as if performing a role. Some researchers propose that the site served ritual or funerary purposes, while others argue for a form of early cosmological mapping. But regardless of interpretation, the fact remains that these early carvings seem intentionally arranged to convey something about power, danger, or the unseen. When later civilizations build their demon hierarchies, the same animals signify the same dangers. The parallel is too consistent to ignore. While continuity between images and later beliefs might easily be explained by the universality of certain animals' symbolic power, a third detail unsettles that comfortable explanation. Among the carvings at these early sites, some depict hybrid creatures that do not correspond to known animals at all. They feature bodies or appendages that later iconography assigns to demons or protective spirits. Archaeologists hesitate to label them outright as supernatural beings, since doing so risks imposing later frameworks onto earlier cultures. Yet the similarities are undeniable. The posture of the creatures, the emphasis on certain anatomical features, the apparent intention to represent something that is neither purely human nor purely beast. These motifs align with demon figures that appear in Mesopotamian texts, even though the two traditions are separated by thousands of years. Scholars debate whether these similarities represent archetypal imagery common to human psychology, or whether they indicate the persistence of an older, pan-regional symbolic vocabulary, now mostly lost. Even so, if the carving parallels were the entire story, you might attribute them to broad human tendencies rather than specific transmission. But the fourth detail complicates everything. Some researchers argue that certain Göbekli Tepe motifs correspond so closely to later demonological beings that coincidence alone becomes difficult to justify. They highlight the alignment of serpent-bird hybrids with apotropaic demons described in ritual contexts. Others push back, insisting that the correspondences are superficial and that drawing direct lines across millennia risks oversimplification. You'll notice how this tension reveals the core of the debate. Are the similarities the result of shared symbolic logic among early humans, or do they represent remnants of an ancient mythological system that preceded writing and later fractured into the traditions we now label as Sumerian, Anatolian, or Levantine? As you follow this thread, the mystery deepens into a shape larger than any single site. The idea that beings resembling later demons appear in pre-literate carvings forces you to reconsider how demonologies developed. Instead of emerging only after writing created organized pantheons and catalogues, perhaps the concepts behind them, fear of hybrid forces, recognition of liminal beings, acknowledgement of predatory power, were already present in the oldest layers of human symbolic thought. If this is true, then demonology is not simply a cultural invention, but a cultural crystallization, a later naming of patterns already embedded in human consciousness. At the same time, you begin noticing how careful scholars are in handling these parallels. Archaeology thrives on cautious interpretation, and many specialists warn against projecting later religious structures backward into eras where writing didn't exist. They argue that hybrid imagery might reflect totemic identities, clan symbols, hunting rituals, or early mythic experimentation with form. These explanations are grounded in methodological restraint. Yet even these scholars acknowledge that the recurrence of certain hybrid motifs across such vast timeframes is unusual. They cannot fully dismiss the possibility that some symbolic continuity exists, even if the mechanism remains unknown. You'll see this debate most clearly when comparing the carved beings at Neolithic sites with the incantation tablets of Mesopotamia. The tablets describe demons whose functions are precise: guardians, attackers, boundary crossers, disease bringers. Their imagery is elaborate and structured, yet traces of that same imagery surface thousands of years earlier in stone. When continuity appears across such immense temporal distance, scholars must decide whether it reflects cultural diffusion, psychological universals, or something more elusive, a persistent way of imagining non-human agency across epochs. What makes the question so difficult is that the Neolithic evidence does not come with commentary. There are no inscriptions describing the beings carved at Göbekli Tepe or other early sites. There is no lexical list comparing species or defining symbolic roles. Everything we know comes from the images themselves. The silence of these stones becomes a second silence in the story of demonology, echoing the divine silence in the first section. And in that silence, your mind begins to fill the gaps with the only data available, the striking visual parallels with later descriptions of supernatural entities. As you explore these stone beings, you also start to notice how the carvings treat boundaries. Just as thresholds in later architecture symbolize liminal vulnerability, the arrangements at Göbekli Tepe often place dangerous animals on the edges of enclosures, as if guarding or patrolling the perimeter. Some pillars show compositions where threatening creatures face outward, their bodies oriented toward what lies beyond the circle rather than within it. This design aligns with later ritual logic, in which apotropaic figures face outward to repel dangers. Yet here the concept appears long before the architectural vocabulary of temples or palaces develops. You sense the emergence of a human instinct to place powerful beings at the borders between the known and the unknown. As the section unfolds, the significance of all these patterns begins to merge. The Neolithic carvings offer glimpses into a symbolic universe older than writing, older than recorded myth, older even than the city-states that would later document the first demonologies. And yet, despite this antiquity, the forms carved into stone prefigure the beings that later civilizations would describe as demons or guardians. This continuity, partial, unexplained, and fragile, creates one of the most profound mysteries in the study of ancient belief systems. You leave this section with an uneasy realization. If these beings were carved before writing existed, then the impulses that shaped demonology reach far deeper into human history than the textual record suggests. The next mysteries will only sharpen that realization, revealing how these ancient forms evolved into entities thought capable of crossing into the human body itself. When you leave behind the mute stones of the pre-literate world and move into the earliest textual descriptions of what later cultures would call possession, the mystery shifts from carved forms to lived experience. What stands out immediately is not theatrical exorcisms or elaborate rituals, but the way different civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and centuries describe the same unsettling phenomenon, something entering the human body, overriding will, and altering consciousness in ways that observers struggled to explain. As you move through this section, you'll notice how these patterns form a web of parallels too persistent to dismiss as coincidence, yet too inconsistent to categorize within a single theoretical framework. What emerges is a landscape of borrowed bodies, transient agencies, and encounters that ancient people repeatedly interpreted as the work of non-human forces. You see the first major thread when you look at Sumerian medical and ritual texts that describe fevers, delirium, and disorientation. Through the language of intrusion, illness wasn't framed merely as a biological imbalance. It was interpreted as the presence of a spirit that had latched on to a person. These descriptions appear in diagnostic handbooks and incantation series, where the practitioner is instructed to identify whether the invading force is a ghost, a demon, or a wandering spirit of uncertain origin. What makes these documents so revealing is the way they frame the problem, not as the body failing, but as the body being occupied. This is the earliest attested form of what later traditions would call possession, an experience defined by a temporary loss of agency and the inability to distinguish between the self and the invading force. The language leaves little doubt that the Sumerians believed some aspects of illness reflected the presence of external beings. Yet even as those records form the earliest textual evidence, the phenomenon doesn't remain confined to Mesopotamia. When you jump forward and sideways across time, another thread appears in Greek literature, where moments of madness or sudden inspiration are attributed to daimons. Greek thinkers often separated daimons from gods, treating them as intermediaries or agents of fate. But in episodes of mania or frenzy, the line between inspiration and intrusion blurs. You'll notice how tragedies, philosophical texts, and medical treatises occasionally describe altered states in terms that echo the Sumerian language of displacement. The person is taken, overcome, entered. Although Greek thought contains multiple explanations for altered consciousness, psychological, medical, divine, the recurring idea that external spirits could momentarily override human intention creates a bridge between the Greek and Mesopotamian worlds. These parallels are especially striking because the two civilizations conceptualized spirits differently, yet they reach similar conclusions about what happens when agency fractures. But if those were the only parallels, you might conclude that ancient cultures simply resorted to supernatural explanations for psychological states they didn't understand. The mystery sharpens, however, when you turn to early Hebrew traditions, where possession takes on forms that combine elements of both earlier worlds, yet remain distinct. These texts, preserved in narratives and commentaries, describe episodes where individuals behave violently, speak with voices not their own, or exhibit knowledge beyond ordinary human capacity. What sets these accounts apart is the emphasis on suddenness. Possession does not build gradually, but descends abruptly, as if the spirit seizes an opportunity or waits for a moment of weakness. This framework aligns with the Sumerian theme of latching on, but the Hebrew texts add another dimension, the idea that the spirit may seek to test, torment, or expose aspects of the human mind. The blend of physical, emotional, and cognitive intrusion makes these narratives difficult to categorize within any single cultural system, yet the core idea remains the same: a borrowed body, a disrupted self, an external presence asserting control. And if possession remained confined to the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, you might attribute these similarities to cultural diffusion. But the fourth element in this chain disrupts that explanation. Indigenous Mesoamerican traditions, separated from the Old World by vast distances, preserve accounts of spirits entering the bodies of humans in temporary episodes of altered consciousness. These descriptions appear in ritual contexts, myths, and even colonial-era commentaries, interpreting pre-colonial customs. The underlying idea, the sudden arrival of an external presence that uses the human body as a vessel before departing, appears once again. What makes these accounts compelling is not just their similarity to Old World narratives, but their independence from them. The phenomenon arises in isolation, suggesting that the concept of borrowed bodies may emerge wherever human beings grapple with experiences that defy internal explanation. If these four strands formed a simple pattern, you might conclude that different cultures experienced similar physiological or psychological episodes and built supernatural explanations around them. Yet the deeper you look, the more difficult that simplification becomes. The cross-cultural parallels are not merely thematic, they follow specific contours. The spirit's entry is sudden, the altered state is temporary. The person's sense of self fractures. Observers interpret the event as evidence of something external, something not normally visible, something with intention. And although the labels differ, demon, daimon, ghost, spirit, the structure of the experience remains consistent. This is where scholars begin to debate whether the parallels reflect universal aspects of human neurological experience, or whether they represent independent attempts to articulate encounters that truly felt like invasions. Even within ancient texts, the descriptions hover between the psychological and the metaphysical. In Mesopotamia, some tablets describe the intruding spirit as causing fever or delirium. In others, the spirit speaks through the afflicted person, using their mouth as a channel. In Greek contexts, daimones sometimes influence emotion or decision-making, rather than overtly seizing control. Yet the result, a sense of being carried by something stronger, is parallel. Hebrew narratives include episodes where the afflicted behave unpredictably or with unnatural strength. Mesoamerican traditions sometimes describe the spirit bringing messages, visions, or physical exhaustion. Each culture offers a different vocabulary, yet the underlying shape remains uncanny. You begin to see that the puzzle is not merely about supernatural belief, but about the problem of fragmented agency. Ancient observers recognized moments when the self seems to weaken or split, moments when thought or action did not feel wholly one's own. In the absence of modern psychological frameworks, the explanation that something external had entered the body became not just plausible but compelling. And because ancient rituals aimed to restore order where chaos intruded, possession became a category that required specialized intervention, whether through incantation, offering, prayer, or ritual cleansing. What makes this all the more intriguing is the way ancient sources describe the departure of the intrusive force. Just as the entry is sudden, the exit is abrupt. Rituals often aim not to destroy the spirit, but to expel it, to push it back across whatever boundary it crossed. The language of casting out, sending away, or removing assumes that the spirit belongs elsewhere, and here the echoes of earlier sections return. Thresholds, boundaries, liminal zones. Possession becomes another form of crossing, another breach in the boundary between human and non-human domains. The borrowed body functions as a temporary threshold, one that must be closed for order to return. As this section draws to its close, you begin to understand why ancient demonologies treat these beings with such ambivalence. They are not always malevolent. Sometimes they reveal knowledge or offer warnings, but their presence disrupts the integrity of the self. That disruption, repeated across continents and millennia, forms one of the most enduring mysteries in the study of ancient belief. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that possession is not an anomaly, but a recurring feature, a sign that the boundary between worlds was believed to be permeable. This recognition leads naturally into the next set of mysteries, where the beings responsible for such intrusions are described not as creations of the gods, but as entities that existed before creation itself, reshaped the cosmos. When you step from the realm of borrowed bodies into the territory of beings described as older than creation itself, the tone of ancient demonology shifts once more. The texts become less confident, the language more cautious, and the boundaries between myth, ritual, and cosmology begin to blur in ways that even ancient scholars seemed unsure how to navigate. As you move through this section, you'll notice how these fragments, small, broken, and often ambiguous, carry an unusual weight. They hint at a class of entities, neither shaped by the gods, nor governed by cosmic order, beings described in some of the oldest tablets as unmade, as if they existed before the categories that define existence were fully established. The first major thread becomes apparent when you examine Assyrian and Babylonian fragments that refer to beings present before order. The wording is precise. These entities are not simply described as old or primordial, but as occupying a state prior to the structured universe outlined in creation myths. In the Mesopotamian worldview, creation is an act of separation, light from darkness, sea from sky, land from ocean. Anything predating that separation occupies a conceptual space that defies definition. When these texts describe spirits from before, they imply beings untouched by the ordering principles, that govern gods and mortals alike. You begin to understand how radical this notion is. Demonology is usually about forces that disrupt the order of the world, yet these unmade beings come from a time before order even existed. Their very presence threatens the logic of the cosmos, because they are not part of its architecture, they are remnants of something older. If this were simply poetic language or mythic embellishment, the mystery would hold less weight. But the second thread sharpens it. Several demon lists categorize certain beings without assigning them parents, realms, or functions. In a system where genealogies anchor divine and demonic hierarchies, the absence of lineage is deeply anomalous. Most demons in Mesopotamian texts originate from specific mythological events or genealogical lines, offspring of particular gods, emanations of destructive forces, or manifestations of ritual imbalance. Yet a subset of entries appear as free-floating designations, lacking any origin story. You'll notice how scholars debate these anomalies. Some argue they reflect lost myths that would have explained the lineage. Others propose that these beings were never meant to be integrated into the pantheon. The fact that scribes included them at all, without contextualizing them, hints that they held significance even without a cosmological place. They become a kind of conceptual residue, acknowledged yet unframed. As you explore this further, another layer emerges from later Babylonian incantations that describe unfinished spirits. These beings are neither ghosts nor gods, neither fully formed nor fully absent. The tablets use terms implying partial existence, a state between being and not being. What makes these inscriptions particularly striking is the ritual context in which they appear. They are invoked or referenced in situations where the practitioner confronts illnesses or disturbances that resist ordinary classification. The language suggests that the disturbance arises not from typical demon classes, but from something more elusive, an entity lacking the essential qualities that allow rituals to operate effectively. If demons of known lineage obey predictable patterns, these unfinished beings disrupt those patterns simply by existing outside the categories that rituals expect. Their presence undermines the entire structure of ritual logic, which depends on identifying the agent involved. Even if those three strands formed the entirety of the pattern, the mystery would already be significant. But the fourth detail makes it even more perplexing. Philologists studying these tablets often point to the troublesome term labanutu, translated loosely as unmade or not created. The problem is that the word does not appear frequently enough to define precisely, and when it does, the surrounding context is equally fragmentary. It seems to describe a characteristic rather than a name, implying that the beings labeled this way lack a specific kind of creation. The challenge lies in understanding what kind of creation the term refers to. Does it mean they were not shaped by the gods, not assigned a role in the cosmos, not subject to the laws of divine authority? Scholars disagree on all three possibilities, and each interpretation carries very different implications. If they are outside the god's creation, they exist beyond divine control. If they are outside cosmic structure, they pose a threat to the integrity of reality. If they are outside divine law, rituals might not bind them at all. Yet the final thread pulls all these uncertainties into a single unresolved debate. When researchers attempt to determine whether these beings represent mythic metaphor or remnants of a lost cosmogony, no consensus emerges. The metaphoric reading suggests that unmade beings symbolize chaos, the ever-present threat of disorder that creation myths aim to suppress. But the alternative interpretation, that these terms reflect actual beliefs about entities that existed prior to the structured cosmos, pushes the discussion into far deeper territory. It implies that ancient people did not simply imagine beings of chaos, but believed that some entities persisted from an earlier, undefined state, continuing to interact with the world, even after cosmic order was established. This possibility transforms the demonological landscape. Instead of demons emerging as consequences of disorder, some might be remnants of a primordial condition that predates gods, morality, or structure itself. As you move deeper into these fragments, you begin to sense how these debates affect the entire framework of ancient thought. Creation myths are not merely stories. they are cosmological maps. They define the boundaries of everything that exists and describe how the world acquired stability. Entities that fall outside this structure, beings that were never created, never assigned function, never granted form, undo the clarity these myths were meant to establish. They represent the parts of existence that the gods did not shape, the remainder of a chaotic substrate that persists beneath or around ordered reality. Their presence in ritual contexts suggests that ancient practitioners confronted experiences they interpreted as arising from forces outside the divine chain of command. One aspect that becomes especially intriguing is how these unmade beings interact with known demons. In some incantations, they appear as allies or amplifiers of more established malevolent forces. In others, they seem to exist entirely apart, intruding at moments when ritualists encounter symptoms or disturbances that fit no established category. The ritual instructions sometimes shift tone when addressing these entities, moving from confident invocation to hesitant language. You can sense the anxiety encoded in the tablets, the recognition that the practitioner is dealing with something outside normal procedural logic. These moments of hesitation reveal the fragility of the ancient ritual system, where certainty depended on classification and classification depended on creation. The tension becomes even more pronounced when you consider how ancient cosmologies incorporated earlier mythic strata into later theological frameworks. Many cultures layered new gods over older ones, reinterpreting earlier myths to fit new political or religious realities. But unmade beings resist this process. They cannot be reinterpreted because they were never assigned a place in the first place. Their very existence challenges the idea that creation imposed total order. They linger as reminders that not everything was contained in the cosmological blueprint. As you reflect on this, you begin to see why these fragments hold such fascination. They represent cracks in the architecture of the ancient world. Not cracks caused by demons rebelling against divine authority, but cracks caused by entities that never participated in the system to begin with. These beings do not disrupt order. They expose the limitations of order. They reveal a conceptual horizon beyond which the ancients could not see, and perhaps did not want to. This horizon marks the boundary between what is inside the cosmos and what lies outside it, between what is defined and what is unmade. And that boundary is where the next section leads you, toward figures described not as primordial or uncreated, but as kings without kingdoms, shadow rulers, whose authority exists without worship, lineage, or temple walls. When you move from beings described as unmade to those carrying titles of royalty without temples, worship, or loyal devotees, the mystery takes on an entirely different shape. The fragments you've explored so far deal with entities outside cosmic structure, but here you encounter figures that appear fully integrated into the symbolic vocabulary of authority, kings, rulers, sovereigns, yet occupy no position in any known divine, political, or cultic hierarchy. What emerges is the paradox of governance without domain, legitimacy without subjects, and power without institutional recognition. As you read through this section, you'll notice how these shadow kings reveal another side of demonology, the appropriation of political language to describe forces that no earthly kingdom, priesthood, or pantheon ever claimed. You first sense the magnitude of this puzzle in Mesopotamian tablets, where certain demons are granted titles that clearly imply rulership. These titles appear in ritual contexts, often listing the entity's power or rank. Yet they never include the expected references to altars, offerings, or priestly obligations. In a world where hierarchy and cult practice were inseparable, the absence of worship is immediately striking. A king in divine literature is never simply a title, it denotes cosmological order. Yet these beings, the so-called kings of shadow, night, or storm, do not oversee regions, seasons, cities, or moral domains. They possess titles, but no thrones, no temples, no ceremonial roots. Their kingship seems to belong to a sphere outside human reach, and this absence of cultic acknowledgement raises a deeper question. Why would ritualists call a being a king if no community recognized its rule? If that anomaly stood alone, you might assume it reflects metaphor or poetic exaggeration. But the second thread complicates every easy interpretation. Laments, incantations, and ritual commentaries occasionally mention kings of darkness or rulers of the unseen. Yet these same texts warn against invoking them in formal ceremony. The tension becomes clear. The titles are not empty, but they are dangerous. Scholars debate whether these beings occupied roles that scribes preferred not to elaborate, or whether their kingship represented an inversion of order rather than a legitimate parallel to divine rule. You'll notice that the tablets offer no origin myths to explain their authority, no battles, no succession stories, no genealogies. Their kingship is simply assumed, as though these entities ruled something unspoken or undefinable. The absence of myth is as telling as the titles themselves. As you trace these figures across different regions, the picture deepens. Some scholars point out that in the context of ritual language, kingship may not always refer to political or divine hierarchy, but to intensity of power. A king may be the strongest or most feared among a class of spirits, the one whose influence outweighs the others. This interpretation opens a pathway to the third dimension of the mystery, because it reveals how the political vocabulary of the ancient world permeated descriptions of unseen forces. When a spirit is too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to worship, the only available language to describe its dominance may be the vocabulary of kingship. And yet, in societies where kings were responsible for maintaining cosmic balance, the existence of rulers who operate outside that balance poses a conceptual threat. These shadow kings have no obligation to uphold order, their authority is untethered. But the fourth and final thread that anchors this block pushes the mystery even further. Scholars working with these materials still cannot determine why these beings never received cultic recognition. If they were so powerful, why did no city-state claim them as protectors or patrons? If they held sovereignty, why was that sovereignty not embedded into civic or temple structure? One argument suggests that their domains lay in zones humans could not approach. The deep underworld, the wilderness beyond mapped territory, or the conceptual spaces between life and death. Another interpretation posits that these kings belong to an older stratum of belief, perhaps inherited from pre-literate or pre-urban traditions, where authority was imagined differently, but none of the hypotheses align neatly with all available evidence. The absence of worship is not simply a missing piece, it is a defining feature. These kings are rulers without subjects, and their power persists precisely because no human institution ever sought to claim them. As you move deeper into this puzzle, you begin noticing how these shadow kings destabilize the very structure of ancient religious life. Temples functioned as political centers, places where divine authority was negotiated and displayed. Gods who occupied high positions in the pantheon had administrators, festivals, and calendar cycles. Even demons with significant roles, guardians of thresholds, bringers of disease, protectors of the dead, were integrated into ritual life in predictable ways. Yet the kings described in exorcistic or mythological fragments remain outside every structure. They appear only when boundaries weaken, when cosmic order trembles, or when ritualists acknowledge forces beyond their jurisdiction. Their kingship seems to be the kingship of disruption, authority held wherever order yields to the undefined. This becomes even clearer when you examine how these titles appear in the context of ritual procedure. In the Moklu series, one of the most comprehensive bodies of Mesopotamian incantations, certain beings are addressed with unusual deference, despite having no temples. The language hints at fear rather than reverence. The practitioner acknowledges their rank, but does not attempt to appease or honor them. Instead, the ritual aims to push them away, limit their influence, or banish them from the afflicted person's life. This dynamic, respect without worship, recognition without devotion, creates a kind of inverted hierarchy. These kings are powerful, but not in the way gods are powerful. Their power lies in their refusal to engage with the structures of cosmic or civic stability. In some contexts, these shadow kings even appear as counterforces to divine authority. They are described as challenging or mocking established order, not through rebellion or warfare, but through sheer indifference. They do not seek dominion over human society. They exist in parallel to it. Scholars sometimes interpret these figures as remnants of older mythic traditions, where different cosmological structures might have existed before the rise of city-states. Others argue that these kings reflect the other side of divine kingship, a dark mirror of the political theology that dominated the ancient Near East. In this view, every god who ruled the sky, city, or cosmos had a counterpart who ruled the margins, the shadows, or the unspoken. Yet this analogy falters when you consider that these kings were not linked to any specific gods. They remain autonomous. You also notice how these shadow kings blur the boundaries between demon and deity. Their power is too great to classify as minor spirits, yet they lack the narrative structure that defines a god. They occupy a conceptual middle ground, one that later demonologists struggle to fit into their schemes. When medieval traditions attempt to compile hierarchies of demons, they often draw on fragments of these older titles, assigning ranks and orders where none existed historically. But these later interpretations mask the original ambiguity. The ancient texts do not present organized infernal kingdoms or demonic bureaucracies. They present kings whose domains are unnamed, undefined, and possibly unbounded. As the section unfolds, you begin to recognize that these figures represent more than a linguistic curiosity or mythological anomaly. They expose the limits of the ancient worldview. Kingship was the highest form of human authority, and labeling a being as king carried profound implications. But when a being carries that title without a domain, it reflects a recognition of power beyond human framing, authority that cannot be domesticated through ritual, myth, or worship. The title becomes a concession. Humans acknowledge supremacy without claiming relationship. This realization prepares you for what comes next, because if these kings rule without altars, without lineage, and without clearly defined spaces, the next set of mysteries turns to entities whose domains are even stranger, spirits assigned not to the known directions of the world, but to a fifth direction, a space outside the compass, a vector pointing somewhere far beyond the mapped universe. When you leave behind the Shadow Kings, figures whose authority existed without territory, you enter a domain that stretches even further beyond the boundaries of the mapped ancient world. What begins to surface in this section is not merely a new class of beings, but a new way of imagining space itself. Ancient cosmologies built their universes around a stable set of directions: north, south, east, west. These cardinal points anchored ritual, travel, political geography, and spiritual orientation. Yet scattered across texts, bowls, tablets, and ritual diagrams appears the same unsettling pattern: references to guardians assigned to a direction not included in the known compass. As you follow these fragments, you start noticing how persistent and how inexplicable this fifth direction becomes. It behaves like an uncharted vector in ancient cosmology, a kind of conceptual doorway pointing somewhere the world's geometry never formally acknowledged. The first strand of this mystery takes form in Bronze Age maps, where the four established directions frame the known world. Yet a fifth marker, poorly explained, often symbolized rather than named, stands apart from the rest. Scholars usually identify these as cosmographic diagrams, not navigational tools, meaning they represent symbolic order rather than physical terrain. But even in that symbolic context, the fifth marker feels anomalous. It carries inscriptions or symbols associated with guarding, keeping watch, or resisting intrusion. And unlike the four cardinal guardians, which align with winds, stars, or deities, this additional one has no corresponding natural force. It doesn't track a sunrise, a monsoon, or a prevailing wind. It stands alone, a direction pointing away from the world rather than through it. This is the first clue that the ancients imagined a frontier not captured by physical geography, a boundary with its own guardian, even though no linguistic framework existed to describe what lay beyond. If that were the only reference, you might attribute it to cartographic embellishment or symbolic layering, but the second thread deepens the puzzle. The spirits assigned to this extra direction lack clear iconography, while guardian figures for the traditional directions often appear as animals, hybrid beings, or divine messengers. The fifth direction entities remain visually opaque. They appear not through images, but through titles, short, cryptic, and often incomplete. Ritual texts refer to them using terms that emphasize absence, the unseen one, the watcher beyond, the spirit of the outer place. The lack of imagery stands out sharply in traditions where visual representation was central to cult and ritual life. Iconography was a language of power. To depict something was, in a sense, to bind it within cultural comprehension. Yet these fifth direction beings remain undescribed, suggesting that either no community dared to represent them, or they existed outside the frameworks representation relied upon. Scholars debate whether this absence reflects taboo, ignorance, or conceptual limitation. As you move deeper, a third dimension appears in Indo-Iranian cosmology, which includes hints, scattered and debated, of beings guarding regions not tied to the terrestrial world at all. Some texts gesture toward beyondward spaces, conceptual zones neither above nor below, neither north nor south. These areas are described not as directions in physical space, but as domains in metaphysical orientation. They represent edges where reality curves or folds, thresholds between layers of existence. In some models, these beings appear in the periphery of the sky. In others, they hover in mythic regions, unconnected to ordinary travel. Scholars argue intensely about how to interpret these descriptions. Are they symbolic references to moral or spiritual realms? Are they survivals of older cosmologies, predating the four-direction model? Or do they encode knowledge of star paths, celestial anomalies, or lost ritual geography? None of the interpretations satisfies fully. The references remain fragments of a worldview where directionality extends into invisible terrain. Yet even if these Indo-Iranian hints were the only parallels, the puzzle might be dismissed as metaphor. But the fourth thread locks the pattern firmly into the realm of textual reality. Ritual bowls, some Aramaic, some Mandaean, some produced by communities blending cultural influences, occasionally list guardians that simply do not align with any known directional system. These inscriptions wrap around the interior of bowls used for protective magic or household rites. They often include angels, demons, ancestral spirits, or local guardians associated with specific winds or quadrants. But occasionally a bowl includes an extra name, an additional entity positioned outside the fourfold structure. The inscription points to a guardian beyond the winds, placed not eastward or westward but outward. Archaeologists studying these bowls note that the extra entry correlates with spells designed to shield the household from forces believed to approach not from within the world, but from outside its normal boundaries. This serves as one of the most concrete indications that some ancient practitioners imagined intrusion not coming from known directions, but from a direction beyond the cosmic map. If the phenomenon ended there, you could explain it as ritual redundancy or scribal improvisation. But the final thread complicates everything by pulling together cultural, linguistic, and conceptual strands into an unresolved question. What did these civilizations believe lay outside the known directions of the world? Scholars propose multiple theories, none conclusively. Some argue the fifth direction refers to the zenith or nadir, up or down, compressed into diagrams otherwise limited to the horizontal plane. Others suggest it symbolizes the center, the point from which all directions radiate, but these explanations struggle when confronted with the textual emphasis on guardianship. You don't assign a guardian to the center, nor do you place one in the sky without explicitly naming the heavens. The inscriptions insist the extra direction is something else entirely, a conceptual space outside the constructed order of the cosmos, and the guardians assigned to it are described not as powerful or benevolent, but as necessary. Something presses from that direction, something that requires containment. As you examine these fragments, you begin noticing how the fifth direction alters the ancient idea of space. In most cosmologies, the world is structured around symmetry and balance. The four cardinal points define stability, predictability, and order. Introducing a fifth point disrupts that symmetry. It destabilizes the map, introduces asymmetry, and implies that the world is not a closed, sealed structure. The cosmos has an edge, and on the other side of that edge lies something potentially hostile or unknown. In this sense, the fifth direction behaves less like a place and more like a breach, a point where the world is vulnerable. This idea resonates strongly with the earlier mysteries you've encountered. Threshold guardians monitored the boundaries of human habitation. Shadow kings ruled realms without defined borders. Unmade beings stepped from outside creation into the structured world. Here, the fifth direction encapsulates all those tensions in spatial form. It is an unanchored boundary, a direction that does not belong to the world, but still presses against it. The guardians stationed there embody vigilance without territory, responsibility without geography. When you follow this line of thought deeper, the implications expand. The beings tied to this direction, though largely unnamed and undescribed, form a category separate from both gods and demons. They are not invoked in rituals of healing, fertility, or divination. They appear only in contexts dealing with protection, containment, and unknown threats. Their guardianship suggests that ancient people believed the world's geometry had weak spots, places where forces beyond comprehension might seep in. And because this direction lacks form, the guardians themselves possess no stable iconography. They are placeholders, conceptual bulwarks against something nameless. This absence becomes even more striking when you consider how profoundly visual ancient religion was. Deities were carved, painted, molded, inscribed. Demons were depicted in terrifying detail, often with specific attributes or gestures. Even abstract ideas, justice, fertility, destruction, were given forms. But the fifth direction guardians remain invisible in the archaeological record. This invisibility feels intentional, as if representation itself risked acknowledging too much. As the section stretches toward its conclusion, you begin piecing together how these fragments reshape the entire landscape of demonology. The idea that a direction outside the world required guardians implies that ancient people conceived of cosmic threats not merely within the known universe, but pressing from beyond its edges. These threats were not embodied in familiar demons or mythic monsters, but in forces that escaped categorization, forces that demanded beings neither worshipped nor depicted, only stationed. This realization leads naturally into the next mystery, where the boundaries between presence and architecture blur, and the voices believed to rise from beneath the foundation stones begin to echo through the historical record, voices that might, in the imagination of ancient practitioners, have originated from that unmapped direction beyond the four winds. When you move from the unmapped fifth direction into the realm beneath construction stones, the sense of liminality becomes even more pronounced. Instead of vast cosmological boundaries or abstract directions on ancient diagrams, you now descend into the smallest cracks of human architecture, places where people built their homes, temples, palaces, and city walls. And it's here, in the literal foundations of ancient life, that the next sequence of mysteries emerges. You'll notice how these accounts treat the act of building not as a neutral craft, but as a moment of confrontation with forces that dwell beneath the surface. The theme shifts from cosmic orientation to physical depth. What lies under the ground? What awakens when humans disturb it? And what must be buried to silence whatever stirs there? The first thread becomes evident in Mesopotamian foundations, where archaeologists consistently uncover apotropaic figurines concealed beneath thresholds, corners, and load-bearing points. These figures were not decorative. They were hidden deliberately, often wrapped or placed in small pits sealed with clay. Many represent hybrid beings, part human, part animal, part something else, crafted with the specific intention of guarding the structure above. You begin to see how the ancients imagined construction as an intrusion into a space that did not belong to them. The earth beneath a building was not an inert support. It was a realm with its own inhabitants. Placing figurines beneath the foundation was not simply protective magic, but a negotiation with the unseen. It acknowledged that whatever existed below might resist or resent the disturbance. The presence of these figurines, consistent across cities and centuries, hints at a widespread belief in forces awakened by building itself. If these buried figures were the only evidence, you might interpret them as symbolic guardians. But the second thread interrupts that comfortable reading. Ritual texts from the same regions explicitly warn of spirits disturbed during construction. These warnings treat the act of digging, cutting, or setting foundations as a moment of vulnerability. They instruct builders and priests to perform specific rites to quiet the earth, appease the ground, or seal the voices beneath. The language does not describe symbolic imbalance. It describes beings plural whose presence becomes active when the soil is broken. The ritual focus is not only on protecting the building, but on preventing awakened forces from ascending into human space. You begin to notice the pattern. The ground itself is imagined as a threshold, and building becomes an act of breaching that threshold. The warnings reflect a worldview in which humans must ask permission from forces that predate architecture. As you move further into this archive of subterranean concerns, a third dimension emerges. Certain demon categories appear exclusively in building contexts. These beings do not show up in lists of disease bringers, storm spirits, or household disruptors. They appear only in instructions related to construction, renovation, or structural collapse. This geographic specificity is highly unusual. Most demons inhabit conceptual domains, illness, madness, the underworld, liminal spaces. But these entities exist solely in the context of foundation work. Scholars still debate what this means. Some suggest these spirits personify the dangers of construction, accidents, collapses, or the instability of shifting soil. Others argue that the beings represent older beliefs about sacred earth spirits adapted into later demonologies, but the exclusivity of their appearance remains unexplained. Why would demons specialize in construction rather than more universal areas of life? The specificity suggests that ancient builders believed the ground beneath a building held unique threats, requiring tailored supernatural responses. Even if the texts alone did not make this case, the archaeological record reinforces it. Excavations at major Mesopotamian sites repeatedly reveal patterns of figurine placement beneath structures. These patterns include repeated positioning of guardian figures at corners, crossings, and central pillars. You'll notice how consistent the arrangements are: pairs, triads, and quartets placed in symmetrical formations, as if mapping an invisible grid of vulnerability. The careful orientation of these figurines implies that builders believed each part of the structure corresponded to a type of potential intrusion, and the figurines themselves vary in composition, some crafted from clay, others from stone, a few from metal, suggesting a range of ritual calibrations depending on the nature of the threat. Archaeologists studying these placements note how similar they are across cities separated by great distances. This consistency reveals a shared logic. Foundation stones required guardians because something beneath them could rise. But the final thread in this block complicates everything by opening the scholarly debate in a direction that remains unresolved. Some researchers argue that the figurines and ritual warnings reflect symbolic attempts to manage architectural risk, natural subsidence, unstable soil, or the anxiety of building permanent structures. Others insist that the textual descriptions of whispering presences and unseen watchers beneath the foundations indicate that ancient practitioners truly believed in supernatural inhabitants of the earth. The debate centers on whether the buried figures represent demons in the literal sense, or symbolic forces of chaos that construction sought to tame. Yet even the symbolic interpretation struggles to explain why these beings appear exclusively in building contexts and nowhere else. If they were mere metaphors, they should appear in other symbolic frameworks, Instead, they remain entangled with the specific act of disturbing the earth. As you reflect on these threads, you begin to realize how foundational these beliefs were to ancient architecture, literally and conceptually. Building was never merely a practical task. It was a cosmological act, an intrusion into a layered universe, where each stratum demanded its own rituals and guardians. The ground beneath a structure was imagined as a living, responsive realm, one that required negotiation rather than domination. The figurines placed beneath floors and thresholds functioned as intermediaries between builders and whatever forces dwelled below. They were meant to absorb, redirect, or silence the presences that might rise through cracks, seams, or weak points in the architecture. This belief extended into the daily lives of inhabitants. Ritual texts sometimes instructed householders to perform cleansing ceremonies, not just within the home, but specifically at its boundaries. The threshold, the corners, the pillars. These zones corresponded to the hidden figurines buried beneath them, reinforcing the idea that the building relied on an ongoing relationship between the visible space above and the invisible forces below. In moments of crisis, illness, death, unexplained noises, or structural failure, people turn to rituals aimed at calming the foundation spirits. These practices underline how deeply the fear of subterranean intrusion shaped life. A building was not secure by virtue of its materials. It was secure because its foundation was spiritually sealed. And as you move toward the end of this section, you begin seeing how this concept interacts with the mysteries explored earlier. The ground becomes another threshold, one not between rooms or realms of the sky, but between the human world and the unseen spaces beneath it. Shadow kings ruled undefined territories. Fifth Direction guardians watched over unmapped cosmic boundaries. Here, the beings beneath foundation stones embody the vertical counterpart to these horizontal and cosmological edges. They represent the downward breach, the possibility that the unknown lies not only beyond the winds, but directly beneath our feet. This realization sets the stage for the next set of mysteries, where the beings themselves begin to change form across eras, shifting, dissolving, and reappearing in altered guises that challenge the stability of their identities. The stones beneath ancient buildings may have been silent, but the images carved on them were not. They evolve, distort, and recombine across centuries, forming the backbone of the next mystery, the faces that shift without explanation. Across the ancient world, images were never static. A carved figure, once struck into stone or moulded into clay, seemed fixed in time, but the beings those images represented were anything but. As you move from the foundations of ancient structures into the iconographic record that survived above them, you begin noticing a phenomenon that unsettles the very idea of continuity. Demon figures whose forms shift across centuries without any clear explanation. You are not looking at the slow stylistic evolution that affects ordinary deities or mythic animals. You are following transformations far more abrupt, inconsistent, and often contradictory. It is this instability, this fluidity of form, that forms the core of the next sequence of mysteries. And what makes it so striking is that these changes occur even when the underlying function or name of the being remains the same, suggesting something deeper than artistic fashion is at work. You first encounter this pattern in the rapid evolution of demon iconography compared to divine imagery. Gods across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and even the Levant maintain recognizable symbolic elements over long periods, specific crowns, animals, emblems, and postures that anchor their identity. But demons do not exhibit the same stability. Their bodies change shape within a few generations, sometimes drastically. One figure might appear with leonine features in an early period, only to shift into a more reptilian or bird-like form later. Another might lose limbs, gain wings, or acquire new hybrid features without any corresponding mythic event to justify the change. This first thread suggests that demons were imagined as inherently unstable beings, entities whose nature resisted containment, not only in ritual, but in image. The visual record becomes a reflection of conceptual volatility, hinting that the ancients understood these forces as capable of shifting forms beyond human comprehension. Yet, even if iconographic instability were a known artistic tendency, the speed of these changes still demands attention. The second thread emerges when you compare figures across eras and regions. Some demons retain only one or two recognizable traits over centuries, perhaps a clawed hand, a distinctive posture, or a terrifying stare, while the rest of the body changes dramatically. This is especially visible in figures such as hybrid guardians or apotropaic spirits whose stance or gesture remain stable, but whose anatomical details morph. Scholars often attribute this to oral transmission. Ritualists describe the beings in words rather than adhering to strict visual guidelines, leading to variations as different artists interpreted the descriptions. Yet this explanation falters when the variations align too closely with shifting ritual needs, suggesting that the beings themselves were understood differently as contexts changed. The iconographic drift points toward a deeper conceptual instability, the idea that demons can adapt, mutate, and reconfigure in response to the circumstances in which they appear. As you move deeper into this visual labyrinth, a third dimension emerges from the work of historians, who propose that some of these shifts may reflect lost oral traditions. The images you see on surviving artifacts are the endpoints of a much larger, unseen chain of reinterpretation. The function of a demon may have remained stable, guardian, attacker, threshold watcher, but its form evolved in parallel with narratives now lost. Without the stories that accompanied these transformations, modern scholars are left with the images alone, forced to infer continuity where textual evidence is missing. You begin to realize how fragile the chain of transmission is. A single demon image from one century might reflect a myth or ritual that disappeared entirely in the next. The changes in form become faint silhouettes of forgotten tales. The very instability you observe may be an echo of a shifting oral landscape rather than conscious reinvention. Yet even this theory cannot explain the fourth thread, which complicates the entire picture. Some shifts in iconography appear deliberate, almost strategic, as though priestly or ritual communities intentionally obscured earlier representations. This hypothesis has gained attention among scholars examining demon seals, tablets, and figurines whose designs show sudden divergences from earlier patterns, without any apparent loss of skill or material constraints. In these cases, the change is not incremental or regionally diverse. It is abrupt and widespread. A figure associated with a specific pose or hybrid form suddenly loses its defining traits across multiple sites. This abruptness suggests an organized decision to alter how the being should be envisioned, perhaps to adapt to new ritual frameworks or to obscure aspects of the being's identity considered too dangerous or esoteric for broader transmission. This introduces a provocative possibility. Iconographic shifts may not reflect confusion or decay, but intentional concealment. The visual record becomes a mask, an evolving veil designed to hide more than it reveals. As the pieces of this mystery accumulate, you begin recognizing a broader pattern. Demons in ancient cultures inhabit conceptual spaces where stability is not expected. Their identities are fluid, their forms negotiable. Where gods require consistent representation to anchor worship, demons require flexibility, perhaps because their roles were tied to contexts that changed more rapidly: illnesses, storms, fears, or environmental dangers. Their forms may have drifted to match evolving cultural anxieties. A serpent-bodied demon in one century might become a canine figure in another, reflecting the fears most pressing in different eras. This fluidity transforms demon iconography into a kind of psychological seismograph, recording shifts in communal anxiety rather than doctrinal theology. And yet, beneath this psychological interpretation lies something more enigmatic. When a demon's form changes while its name and function remain consistent, you confront a conceptual paradox: the continuity of the unseen paired with the mutability of its manifestation. This suggests that ancient practitioners understood demons not as fixed beings, but as forces that could appear differently depending on the context of the encounter. The iconographic record becomes a visual acknowledgement of this idea. Instead of capturing the true form of a demon, which perhaps was considered impossible, artists depicted what the demon appeared like in a specific moment or ritual framework. The images represent not a static identity, but an event, a manifestation. This interpretation casts demon imagery not as portraits, but as witness accounts. This raises a larger question. If demons were understood as beings that change form, did ancient cultures believe they lacked fixed identity altogether? Some texts hint at this. Descriptions of certain malevolent beings emphasize their shape-shifting nature, their ability to evade recognition or disguise their presence. When an entity is described as approaching in many forms or appearing in the shape it chooses, the iconographic instability becomes a logical extension of narrative identity. The artwork does not fail to capture the demon. It represents only one possible guise, and as the traditions evolve, the preferred guise shifts with them. But even this understanding does not fully resolve the tension. The abruptness of some iconographic transitions suggests more than spontaneous adaptation. It hints at ritual strategy and intentional withholding of esoteric knowledge. In certain periods, priests may have altered images to prevent uninitiated people from accessing dangerous information. Some scholars argue that demon images were deliberately obscured to maintain ritual control. If the demon's true form was known only to specialists, altering the public iconography would serve as protection. This hypothesis aligns with patterns in other esoteric traditions, where depictions of powerful beings shift intentionally to prevent unauthorized invocation. The demon's true image becomes a secret, protected by ritual communities and hidden behind layers of visual distortion. As you reflect on these shifting faces, the connections to earlier mysteries become clear. Just as names resisted stable form and thresholds enforced boundaries between worlds, the fluidity of demon imagery reveals a larger truth. The ancient imagination conceived these beings as fundamentally unstable, defined not by essence, but by interaction. Their identity emerges not from form, but from function, not from lineage, but from behavior, and that instability prepares you for the next set of mysteries, in which words themselves, oaths, formulas, and unspoken phrases become the battleground where human and non-human agency intersect. Because if the faces of these beings could change without warning, the language used to bind them would need to be just as precise and just as dangerous. When you follow the trail from unstable faces to unstable words, you enter one of the most precarious territories in ancient demonology, the realm of oaths, formulas, and ritual utterances that were believed to bind, banish, or constrain forces that resisted every other form of control. What becomes immediately clear is that language, so central to ancient cosmology, law, and ritual, did not always behave the way practitioners expected. You've already seen how some names refuse to settle into stable form. Now you encounter something even more unsettling: formulas, so dangerous they were only partially recorded, oaths, so volatile they were taught in fragments, and rituals so feared that later scribes warned explicitly against speaking them aloud. This section brings you deeper into the tension between language as a tool of power and language as a risk, where speaking the wrong word, even correctly, might cause more harm than silence. The first thread reveals itself in the fragments of ancient initiatory oaths that survive only in scattered syllables. Scholars studying these texts note how consistent the pattern is. Instead of full phrases, the tablets preserve partial utterances, truncated lines, or isolated consonants. Some breaks can be attributed to damage, but others appear intentional, placed exactly where the forbidden elements should have been. When you examine the structure, you see that these oaths were designed to give novices access to restricted ritual knowledge. Yet the essential parts, the phrases believed capable of invoking or stirring dangerous beings, remain absent. This selective preservation suggests that even the scribes feared the power of complete transcription. The missing segments become part of the mystery. Were they profanely dangerous, or spiritually, or both? What matters is that they were removed not by accident, but by choice. And the fear encoded in that choice tells you how seriously these communities viewed the risks of certain sounds. If this were an isolated tradition, confined to one region, you might conclude that it reflects local caution or superstition. But the second thread broadens the pattern dramatically when you encounter the Maklu series, one of the most extensive bodies of Mesopotamian anti-demonic ritual texts. These tablets contain formula after formula designed to purge malevolent beings from homes, bodies, and boundaries. Yet within them appear strict warnings against repeating some of the utterances outside the ritual setting. The language is unambiguous. Certain phrases must not be spoken except under precise conditions and with proper purification. This prohibition implies that the formulas themselves were seen as activating forces that could not easily be dismissed once invoked. When you compare multiple copies of the Maklu series, you notice that some scribes even reduced specific words to shorthand or cryptic marks, as though to ensure they could not be pronounced accidentally. This deepens your understanding. In the ancient world, a word was not a symbol, it was an act. And in the case of certain oaths, the act carried a cost no ritualist wanted to risk casually. As you move across cultures, the third thread sharpens this tension. Greek mystery cults, known for their elaborate initiation rituals, also preserved references to invocations that initiates were not allowed to repeat outside sacred space. Philosophers like Plato and later commentators describe these formulas obliquely, alluding to phrases that contain dangerous names or words that reshape the soul. In some cases, these utterances were believed to summon or engage daimons whose presence was beneficial only within ritual boundaries. Outside those boundaries, the same beings could become hostile or disruptive. This raises a larger question. Did the ancients believe the oaths themselves summoned the beings, or did they believe the beings were already present and the words merely revealed them? The sources do not answer definitively. Instead, they emphasize restraint, silence, and the consequences of misuse. Even with all this evidence, you might still conclude that the power attributed to these formulas reflects cultural anxiety or the legacy of oral secrecy. But the fourth thread complicates this interpretation by exposing a linguistic puzzle. Many of the most dangerous formulas remain untranslated even today because they do not conform to the grammar or vocabulary of the languages surrounding them. Some segments appear in code, others in archaic dialects, still others in forms that may never have corresponded to any natural language. Scholars debate whether this reflects deliberate obscurity designed to protect ritual knowledge from outsiders, or whether the utterances belong to esoteric linguistic traditions now lost entirely. The ambiguity pushes the boundaries of the mystery. If these oaths were intended to contain beings or forces, perhaps obscuring them was part of the control mechanism. Yet the difficulty of reconstructing them, even with modern methods, suggests they may have always existed at the edge of linguistic comprehension. And then comes the fifth and final thread of this block, the presence of oath segments that remain not just untranslatable, but conceptually opaque. Even when individual words can be parsed, the phrases do not align with known ritual structures. They seem to operate outside the typical logic of invocation or supplication. Scholars examining these phrases note the absence of familiar cues, no deity names, no appeals to cosmic order, no references to ritual objects. Instead, the phrases rely on rhythm, repetition, or sound patterns that feel more performative than semantic. These utterances resist interpretation in the same way some demons resist naming or image. Their nature cannot be fully contained within language, suggesting that the ancients may have understood them as sounds with power rather than meaning, and this places the formulas in a unique category, neither descriptive nor narrative, but instrumental. The deeper you go, the more the pieces start to fit together. Oaths in ancient demonology were not merely promises or declarations. They were mechanisms. They opened, closed, sealed, or redirected the pathways through which unseen forces moved. In this sense, an oath functioned like a lock or a conduit, and just as you would not publish the design of a dangerous key without expecting consequences, Ancient scribes limited access to the formulas they believed could influence the unseen world. This explains why so many of these utterances appear in incomplete form. Knowledge was power, but power was also perilous. Only those trained to navigate the dangers were permitted access, and even they were warned to use caution. You begin noticing how these linguistic concerns aligned with earlier themes. Just as thresholds required guardians and demon forms resisted fixed depiction, the boundaries of language itself became zones of instability. Words could protect or endanger, bind or unravel. The ritual specialists who handled them were custodians of fragile borders between silence and utterance, between meaning and presence. The unspeakable nature of certain formulas reflects not a prohibition imposed from without, but a recognition that language itself was a tool capable of summoning or disturbing beings that lay beyond normal comprehension. What makes this even more intriguing is that these ancient anxieties about dangerous language echo through later traditions. Medieval grimoires warn about mispronounced names, causing rituals to backfire. Early Islamic texts caution against reciting specific pre-Islamic incantations. Jewish mystical sources differentiate between safe and unsafe permutations of divine names. Across all these systems, the same principle appears. Language can reach too far, and when it does, the boundaries between the human and the supernatural blur. As the section draws toward its close, you begin recognizing the trajectory these mysteries form. Faces shift, names fragment, oaths dissolve, and language becomes a contested ground. Every attempt to categorize, depict, or bind these beings encounters resistance, forcing the ancients to adapt their rituals, their art, and their speech. And with each adaptation, demonology becomes less a catalogue of beings and more a record of humanity's attempt to navigate an unstable universe. This sets the stage for the next sequence of mysteries, where the silence of the desert becomes the primary witness, and where creatures that leave no images and no names are known only for the sounds they made under moonlit skies, beings encountered not in temples or tablets, but in the vast, uncharted night. When you follow the trail from forbidden oaths to the open expanse of the desert, the tone of ancient demonology shifts once again, this time toward vast silence, star-choked horizons, and an environment where the boundaries between the human and the unseen become dangerously thin. Unlike the tablets of Mesopotamia or the carved pillars of Anatolia, the desert leaves no archive of its own. It records nothing, explains nothing, preserves nothing. All that survives are inscriptions scratched into rock faces, fragments of poetry, travelers' accounts, and ritual warnings. Yet these scattered traces point repeatedly toward the same presence, beings that move through the desert night without belonging to the better-known categories of spirits or gods. What you encounter here is not a structured demonology, but a field of absence, beings defined by silence, glimpses, and the uncanny consistency of descriptions across cultures that never unified their beliefs. The first thread emerges from pre-Islamic Arabian lore, where chroniclers list nocturnal entities that are explicitly distinguished from jinn. This distinction surprises many because the jinn are dominantly known as the supernatural population of the desert. Yet in the earliest layers of Arabian beliefs, there are mentions of other beings, vague, humanoid, and nameless, who appear only at night and only in certain stretches of uninhabited land. Their behavior does not match the jinn traditions later codified in poetry and scripture. Instead, they appear as watchers or wanderers, drifting at the edges of human perception. The texts emphasize that they are not summoned, not negotiated with, and not part of any ritual system. They simply exist where human presence is thinnest, and their appearance, always uninvited, was taken as a sign that the desert itself contained layers beyond what people could claim or understand. If this were the only tradition referencing such beings, you might attribute it to poetic metaphor or tribal superstition. But the second thread adds weight. Inscriptions found across the Arabian Peninsula, etched into sandstone and basalt, refer to night walkers or those who pass in darkness. These inscriptions do not belong to elite scribes or formal rituals. They are casual marks left by travelers, shepherds, or nomads. Their tone is not ceremonial, but observational. The writers carve warnings, invocations, or simple acknowledgements. Beware the night walkers, they pass here, or do not sleep on this side. The starkness of the language, devoid of cosmic explanation, suggests first-hand fear rather than inherited myth. Scholars examining these inscriptions argue that they reflect localized attempts to make sense of experiences in the desert that defied expected categories. What haunts these messages is the lack of detail. The beings are recognized, but never described. It is as if the desert itself erased specificity, leaving only the memory of an encounter. As you look closer, the third thread emerges from discussions among philologists and historians who attempt to classify these nocturnal beings. The challenge is that the descriptions do not align with known categories of Arabian spirits, and the inscriptions provide no taxonomy. Instead, the texts use ambiguous terms. They, the silent ones, the watchers, that resist precise definition. Scholars debate whether these beings represent transitional forms of jinn belief, remnants of older mythic populations, or symbolic expressions of the danger inherent in the desert. None of the explanations fully satisfy the evidence. The ambiguity becomes part of the mystery. These beings inhabit a conceptual space where classification fails, a category defined more by what is withheld than what is given. You begin to see how the desert, with its emptiness and unpredictability, shapes beliefs that evade the structured demonologies of cities and temples. The fourth thread brings you north toward Nabatean and related cultures, where similar descriptions appear in inscriptions and funerary contexts. Here too the silent ones are recorded as nocturnal presences that move among abandoned structures, deep waders or caravan routes. What stands out is the recurrence of warnings, not elaborate mythology. Travelers write that certain paths should be avoided after sunset. Shepherds caution against sleeping near specific rock formations. In Nabatean sites where inscriptions mention these beings, no offerings or altars accompany them. They receive no worship, no petitions, no appeasement, only avoidance. The universality of avoidance becomes the defining attribute. And because these warnings appear across multiple regions, languages, and time periods, a pattern emerges. These desert entities were understood not as integrated components of cosmology, but as unpredictable presences that simply existed in the world's vast, unwatched spaces. Taken together, these threads reveal a category of beings unlike any you've encountered so far. They are neither the structured guardians of thresholds, nor the kings of undefined domains. They are not the unmade remnants of pre-cosmic chaos, nor the mutating forms captured in shifting iconography. They occupy a different register, one shaped not by ritual, myth, or political symbolism, but by geography itself. The desert forms its own cosmology, a place where sight fails, sound carries strangely, and loneliness magnifies every uncertainty. The beings inhabiting this landscape seem to share its qualities. They emerge only in moments of vulnerability, when travelers are isolated, disoriented, or exhausted. This suggests that ancient people did not simply fear the desert, they perceived in it a kind of agency, a set of presences capable of interacting with the living. You begin to notice how these fears intertwine with practical concerns. Night travel in the desert was dangerous. Cliffs, pits, predators, and exhaustion could kill as surely as any spirit. The warnings carved into stone might reflect a blend of spiritual belief and pragmatic caution. But the consistency of the terminology across distant regions implies more than environmental anxiety. Different languages use terms that emphasize silence, watching, or passing unseen, traits not tied to specific dangers, but to a sense of being observed. This shared psychological experience reinforces the notion that the desert enforced a particular kind of awareness. When the landscape is empty, every sound becomes a potential presence, and when the horizon is endless, every shadow becomes a possibility. Out of this tension arose beings defined not by story, but by sensation. Yet even with this psychological grounding, you still face the unresolved question that makes this section part of a larger demonological mystery. Why did so many cultures differentiate these beings from the rest of their spirit taxonomy? If they were simply variants of jinn, ghosts, or local spirits, they would have been assimilated into those categories over time. But they weren't. Instead, they remained separate. Their silence, their refusal to engage with ritual, and their lack of narrative context made them outsiders within the supernatural order. They existed literally and conceptually beyond the boundaries of settled life. Their domain was not a kingdom, threshold, or cosmological edge. It was pure emptiness. This returns you to a theme that has been growing across the previous sections: the tension between named and unnamed forces. The beings of the desert, like the Fifth Direction Guardians, resist naming. Their anonymity becomes part of their identity. In cultures where naming a being granted power over it, the inability to name these presences signaled a lack of control, and in the desert, where survival depended on mastery of terrain, encounters with forces that defied even the simplest classification must have been deeply unsettling. As the section moves toward its conclusion, you begin seeing how the quiet presence of these nocturnal entities connects to the broader currents of ancient demonology. The desert becomes another threshold, not between rooms, directions, or worlds, but between presence and absence. These beings embody the edge where human perception fails, where silence becomes a form of communication, and where the vastness of the landscape hints at unseen watchers. They are the supernatural expression of the desert's indifference, its loneliness, its immensity. And from this domain of wandering nocturnal presences, the path leads toward a new kind of mystery, one rooted not in landscapes of silence, but in the rituals of the dead. Because while the desert harbored beings no one summoned, funerary rites across the ancient world speak of entities that arrived uninvited, drawn not to emptiness, but to the presence of mourning itself. When you leave the empty silence of the desert and step into the charged stillness of ancient funerary rituals, the atmosphere changes completely. The desert revealed beings that move through absence. Burial rites reveal beings drawn to presence, specifically the presence of death, transition, and grief. What emerges in this section is a pattern that unsettles the foundational idea behind ritual practice, that funerary ceremonies existed not simply to honor the dead, but to protect the living from entities attracted to the moment when a life crossed the boundary into the unseen. And the most striking aspect of this mystery is not the existence of funerary spirits. Those appear in many traditions, but the fact that countless texts insist these beings arrived without being summoned, uninvited witnesses at the threshold between life and death. The first thread appears in Sumerian laments, where scribes warn that certain spirits draw near when the body grows cold. These laments are not mythic poetry. They are ritual instructions embedded in mourning practices. The language is precise. Some beings are said to gather at the edges of funerary spaces, watching, listening, or waiting. They are neither the deceased nor the known underworld deities. They appear as additional presences, observers rather than participants. What makes this description uniquely troubling is the implication that death itself creates a signal, a disturbance that attracts entities not normally involved in human affairs. You begin to see how ancient mourners feared not only the passage of a soul, but the attention it might draw. In this worldview, funerary rites were not only pathways for the deceased, but shields for the living, protecting them from forces that approached out of habit or hunger. If you followed only this Mesopotamian trail, you could interpret these beings as symbolic stand-ins for the anxiety surrounding death. But the second thread expands the picture dramatically when you examine Egyptian funerary texts that mention watchers or beholders stationed near tomb entrances. These watchers are distinct from the well-known deities who guide the soul in the afterlife. They are described instead as presences that appear during the physical preparation of the body. The texts instruct priests to perform apotropaic rites not only for the deceased, but also against these watchers. Their purpose remains unclear. They do not escort the soul. nor do they guard the tomb from robbers. The fact that priests felt compelled to fend them off suggests the Watchers represented an unpredictable class of beings responding to the vulnerability that death exposed. Here again, the moment of transition draws attention from forces that sit outside the structured divine hierarchy. As the pattern widens, a third dimension becomes visible. Certain entities appear exclusively in funerary contexts, never in household rituals, agricultural rites, or healing ceremonies. These beings seem activated only when death occurs, as though the process of separation between body and soul creates conditions that allow them to manifest. Scholars note that many of these spirits lack mythological backstories. They appear fully defined in function, but not in origin. Their names, when preserved, often translate into terms like the one who lingers, the one who follows, or the one who sits near. This reinforces the sense of intrusion. They arrive uninvited, not as agents of cosmic order, but as opportunistic presences. The exclusivity of their appearance raises questions about how ancient people understood the boundary between life and death. If certain beings only emerge at funerals, then death is not just a transition, it is a breach. If the evidence stopped here, you might conclude these spirits represent cultural anxiety. But the fourth thread pushes the mystery further by framing it as a scholarly debate. Experts still disagree on whether the presence of these uninvited beings reflects literal belief, symbolic representation, or ritual coding. Some argue the spirits symbolize grief itself, a manifestation. Others believe they represent social fears, such as enemies, outcasts, or malevolent forces exploiting death's vulnerability. Yet the textual consistency across cultures complicates these interpretations. When Sumerians, Egyptians, and other ancient civilizations all warn of beings arriving at funerals without ever constructing major myths around them, it suggests a conceptual category older and deeper than religious doctrine, a recognition that death as an event attracts forces beyond simple description. Then comes the fifth thread. Other cultures describe similar uninvited figures, reinforcing the idea that this is not an isolated belief, but a cross-cultural pattern. Hittite rites mention presences that appear when the breath leaves the body. Early Hebrew texts occasionally allude to spirits of the wasteland, drawn to scenes of mourning. Even distant traditions show parallels, beings lingering near funeral pyres in early Indo-European contexts, or figures observed at the edges of burial grounds in Anatolia. These beings share traits with neither ancestors nor underworld rulers. They resemble the desert presences in their silence, but their attention is specific. They come only when death transforms a place into liminality, when a body becoming a corpse shifts the boundary between presence and absence. As you explore this convergence, the underlying logic of ancient funerary practice begins to change shape. Death was not only a passage for the deceased, it was a moment of exposure for the living. Ritual purity, protective incantations, laments and offerings were designed not solely for the soul, but for the environment of the living mourners. The uninvited beings were thought to interact with the living, not the dead. They might cause illness, confusion, bad fortune, or disturbances if not properly repelled. In this framework, funerary rites functioned as a kind of containment protocol, guiding one presence out while preventing others from getting in. You begin to notice how this mystery resonates with earlier sections. Threshold guardians protected doorways, fifth direction spirits guarded cosmic breaches, foundation figurines sealed the boundaries beneath homes. Here, funerary rites attempt to seal the boundary opened by death itself. The corpse becomes a threshold, a moment where the human world is vulnerable. These uninvited spirits are drawn not out of malice, but out of nature. They respond to a change in the world structure that humans cannot easily detect. The ancients may not have conceptualized these beings as evil. Instead, they likely understood them as natural inhabitants of the liminal zone created when a life ends. The idea becomes clearer when you consider the specific places where these beings appear: tomb entrances, burial pits, pyre remnants, and mourning sites are all transitional spaces, locations where the living and the dead briefly coexist. The uninvited spirits seem to inhabit that overlap, drawn to the instability of the moment. That instability explains why so many cultures develop rituals to close the funeral. Washing the body, sealing the tomb, burning the pyre, or withdrawing from the burial site were not only acts of respect, they were acts of separation. They signaled the end of the liminal moment, pushing the uninvited presences back into whatever terrain they came from. As the section progresses, you begin piecing together a broader realization. The ancients did not fear death itself so much as the things it attracted. The liminal moment, when the soul leaves the body, creates an opening, a temporary rift in the fabric of ordinary existence. And that rift, like any threshold, draws attention from entities that exist in adjacent layers of reality. The fear was not of the deceased, but of the watchers, who had no stake in human life, no role in cosmic order, and no allegiance to gods or ancestors. Their presence was neither good nor evil, it was simply disruptive. This interpretation casts funerary demonology as a complex interplay of cosmology, psychology, and ritual pragmatism. Death is a moment of destabilization, and destabilization attracts forces that thrive in uncertainty. The warnings embedded in ancient texts are not attempts to build mythology, but attempts to manage fear. By naming the presence, even vaguely, these cultures acknowledged the need for caution. By refusing to elaborate, by leaving the beings undefined, they preserved the boundary between ritual knowledge and speculation. As the section closes, the trajectory of the mystery points toward a deeper question. If uninvited spirits attended funerals, what other symbols or signs might have moved independently of human intention? The next section explores that question through marks, seals, and symbols that appeared across the ancient world, sometimes where no ritual tradition should have carried them, suggesting that influence, like presence, can travel across boundaries no culture fully understood. When you follow the path from uninvited funerary presences into the realm of marks and symbols, you step into a landscape where physical objects carry mysteries as deep as any demonology text. Unlike the desert beings defined by silence or the watchers drawn to death, the entities of this section reveal themselves not through direct encounter, but indirectly through patterns that appear carved into stone, painted on pottery, scratched into metal, or impressed in clay across regions that had no meaningful contact with one another. What makes this mystery so arresting is not the existence of symbols themselves. Cultures have always developed signs, but the uncanny recurrence of certain forms, motifs related to protection, danger, or liminality that appear in civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. These symbols act like echoes of an older, untraceable logic. They persist where they shouldn't, cross boundaries no culture remembered crossing, and carry implications that scholars still struggle to explain. You first notice this pattern when comparing protective marks found in Bronze Age Anatolia with those discovered in far older Neolithic contexts. Some appear nearly identical, a branching figure enclosing a central point, a set of 3 angled lines radiating outward, a spiral fused to a triangular base. Archaeologists classify them as apotropaic or protective, but those labels solve nothing. What matters is the continuity of specific geometric structures across vast stretches of time. These marks appear in contexts associated with thresholds, door frames, tomb entrances, storage rooms, and even ritual altars. The implication is that they were meant to prevent something from crossing into human space, and yet their recurrence across cultures with no direct communication challenges simple diffusion theories. You begin to sense that these symbols reflect a shared human fear, the idea of intrusion, of unseen forces passing through the edges of domestic or sacred zones. Yet, even as you trace these marks across regions, the second thread disrupts the idea of a straightforward, protective vocabulary. A distinct set of symbols, those associated with danger or prohibition, also recur unexpectedly across cultures. In some cases, the symbols appear inverted or distorted, but the underlying pattern is unmistakable. A zigzag bisected by a vertical line, a pair of circles connected by a single stroke, a diamond enclosing a smaller offset diamond. These motifs appear carved into objects that the ancients treated with extreme caution: ritual knives, sealed jars, boundary stones. The zigzag, for example, often accompanied warnings inscribed in Aramaic, Akkadian, or South Arabian dialects, warnings about beings or forces that should not be disturbed. Its presence on objects unrelated to one another suggests that its meaning survived in oral traditions that left no written explanation. The consistency of this symbol across so many contexts challenges the idea that its recurrence is merely coincidental. If the protective marks create boundaries to keep forces out, these danger symbols mark sites where forces might already reside. As you explore further, a third dimension emerges when you examine regions where these symbols should not appear at all. In parts of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have located pottery shards and stone fragments bearing symbols that match those in Mesopotamian, Anatolian, and Levantine contexts almost exactly. Yet these regions did not share ritual systems or demonological traditions with the Near East. The presence of these symbols in such contexts forces scholars to consider whether their recurrence reflects an ancient substratum of shared symbolic logic or an as-yet undocumented network of cultural exchange. Neither explanation fully satisfies the evidence. The substratum hypothesis struggles with the sheer specificity of some symbols, while the exchange hypothesis falters under the absence of corresponding ritual structures. What remains is a category of marks that seem to move independently of the cultures that adopted them. This leads directly into the fourth thread, which introduces a debate among archaeologists and philologists. Have certain symbols been misclassified as decorative when they may serve a protective or apotropaic function? This question arises from objects where the marks appear in places that make little aesthetic sense: on the underside of bowls, inside sealed jars, or on the inner walls of rooms where no one would ever see them. Decorative motifs are meant to be visible, but these hidden marks serve no visual purpose. Their placement suggests that the makers believed the symbols held power even when unseen. In some cases, these marks appear in layers of construction that would later be concealed by plaster or stone. This challenges the idea that decoration was their purpose. Instead, it implies that the symbols functioned as silent participants in the architecture, forming part of an invisible ritual framework. And the recurrence of these same hidden motifs across distant cultures complicates the matter further. How did such specific practices arise independently? Or did they descend from forgotten traditions that predated the rise of major civilizations? Even taken together, these threads would form a compelling mystery. But the most perplexing element emerges in the fifth and final thread of this block: the presence of symbols that appear across vast distances, with no clear path of transmission. These symbols, sometimes geometric, sometimes abstract, surface not only in the Near East and Mediterranean, but in regions far beyond, including parts of the Caucasus and the Western Steppe. Scholars studying these similarities caution strongly against overstating the connection. Symbolic convergence can happen independently. Humans across different environments often create similar shapes, but even these cautious voices admit that in some cases the parallels are too precise to dismiss easily. A symbol consisting of a central dot surrounded by 4 outward-pointing lines appears in protective contexts across multiple regions. A double spiral motif linked to boundary rituals surfaces in places separated by enormous distances. These patterns strain the limits of simple convergence and challenge the assumption that all symbols evolve in isolation. As you synthesize these pieces, you begin realizing that symbols in ancient demonology do not function merely as representations. They act as tools, mechanisms by which ancient people attempted to map, mark, or contain the unseen. Their occurrence across unrelated cultures hints at shared concerns about vulnerability, intrusion, and liminality. Yet the persistence of specific motifs, appearing in contexts associated with danger or protection, suggests more than common human psychology at work. These symbols behave like artifacts drifting across cultural boundaries, detached from the stories that once explained them. Their power, meaning, and origin may have long since vanished, leaving only forms etched into stone and clay. This recognition aligns with the broader themes you've seen throughout earlier sections. The desert revealed beings defined by absence, funerary rites introduced watchers drawn to transition, foundations concealed guardians against intrusion, oaths preserved dangerous fragments of lost speech. Here, symbols become the silent residue of interactions that left no narrative. They mark places where the human world felt thin, where signs were needed to reinforce boundaries against forces that could not be otherwise described. As this section concludes, you sense where the trajectory is heading. If symbols can drift across eras and regions, unmoored from their original contexts, what other aspects of demonology might travel with similar independence? The next section leads you toward the possibility that certain beings did not merely persist but evolved, changing names, attributes, and functions across centuries in ways that challenge the linear assumptions of historical development. You step into a realm where entities do not disappear, they transform. When you step from drifting symbols into the question of beings that seem to evolve across eras, the landscape of ancient demonology takes on an unexpected complexity. You have seen how certain presences hover at thresholds, how unnamed watchers attend funerals, how guardians protect foundations, and how marks and symbols travel without explanation. But here the mystery becomes more personal, because instead of dealing with forces that resist naming or depiction, you begin encountering entities whose identities persist yet change, as though adapting to new cultural environments. This section is a breather in the overall arc, but its mystery carries some of the deepest implications. The possibility that certain demonic figures shifted attributes, functions, and even moral valence across centuries, emerging in new eras under new names, while retaining unmistakable traces of older forms. You first notice this phenomenon when examining Near Eastern beings, whose core traits remain consistent despite dramatic changes in theological context. A figure might begin as a storm-associated spirit in one period, appear as a boundary crosser in another, and later be reframed as a nocturnal wanderer. Yet the underlying qualities, movement through liminal spaces, connection to unpredictable natural forces, or affinity with illness, remain stable. This becomes especially visible when comparing entities across Akkadian, Babylonian, and later Aramaic texts. A being associated with fever might evolve into one linked to madness. A threshold guardian might reappear as a house-disturbing spirit. Scholars argue about whether this indicates direct continuity or merely the recycling of traits across unrelated entities. But when the parallels become too precise, when posture, function, and danger all align across centuries, the idea of evolution becomes difficult to ignore. The first thread, then, is this persistence of function. Even as names and roles shift, certain beings maintain a recognizable behavioral core. If that were the only pattern, you might assume that scribes simply reused motifs for convenience. But the second thread complicates this interpretation. The same beings appear differently in moral frameworks that evolve drastically over time. An entity once considered a natural or morally neutral force becomes framed later as malevolent or oppositional. In some cases, the being transitions from an ambivalent guardian to a dangerous intruder. Scholars studying these transformations note that changes in religious doctrine often reshape the way spirits are categorized. As gods become more centralized or moral systems more rigid, earlier beings that once held ambiguous roles are reclassified as adversarial. This moral reframing reveals not only theological evolution, but also cultural reinterpretation. A society under political stress might reimagine a once protective spirit as a threat. A shift in ritual practice might reassign its function entirely. The being itself remains conceptually recognizable, but its ethical position shifts with the needs of the community. Yet even this moral transformation does not fully explain the third and most delicate thread. Some beings appear to migrate, carrying their core traits across regions separated by language, politics, and time. Historians working in comparative demonology have noted how certain figures share attributes across cultures that should not have been in communication. A nocturnal female entity linked to wind-borne illness appears in unrelated traditions. A threshold guardian with leonine and avian features emerges in regions that never shared symbolic exchange. The recurrence of hybrids, tempests, disease-bringers, or dream invaders suggests that traits, not full beings, traveled across boundaries, or that beings themselves were reinterpreted along existing conceptual frameworks. Scholars debate whether this reflects diffusion, coincidence, or archetypal thinking, but the specificity of certain shared traits challenges coincidence. The same gestures, postures, or behavioral patterns reappear with startling consistency. Migration becomes a metaphor for how human fears move, evolve, and settle into new contexts, while retaining echoes of older forms. And yet, amid these possibilities, the fourth and final thread of this block brings the debate into tension. Scholars still cannot determine whether these evolutions indicate genuine continuity or independent reinvention. Some argue that the parallels represent a single, ancient, symbolic library that different cultures accessed. Others believe these beings reflect universal human attempts to grapple with illness, death, or environmental danger. The lack of consistent genealogies, coupled with the fragmentary nature of the evidence, prevents a definitive conclusion. What remains is the sense that certain figures, whether literal beings or conceptual constructs, possess a kind of persistence that transcends cultural boundaries. They adapt, transform, and survive in new forms, mirroring changes in human society while maintaining the essential qualities that first defined them. As you draw these threads together, a broader picture begins to emerge. Demonology, far from being a static catalogue of beings, behaves like a living system, shifting in response to cultural pressures, absorbing new attributes, discarding old ones, and reconfiguring itself in the process. The beings who populate this system are not fixed identities. They are evolving narratives, shaped by the fears, rituals, and imaginations of the societies that encountered them. Their transformations reveal as much about human history as about the supernatural frameworks those humans constructed. This fluidity ties back to earlier mysteries. Just as names fragmented, symbols drifted, and images mutated, the beings themselves evolved. Their identity is not anchored in a single form, but in a cluster of functions and traits that move across time, like shadows, shifting with the angle of the sun. It is not the name that persists, nor the image, but the underlying pattern. Fear of illness, fear of violation, fear of intrusion, fear of thresholds. The beings who embody these fears return again and again, reshaped by the societies that inherit them. And with this understanding, the stage is set for the next mystery. How entire cities once attempted to negotiate directly with such forces, embedding their presence into architecture, ritual cycles, and civic identity. Because the beings that transformed across eras did not merely evolve, they were invited, resisted, or accommodated in ways that shaped the destiny of ancient urban life. When you move from evolving beings to the city that tried to negotiate with them, you enter one of the most revealing and least understood chapters in ancient demonology. Cities across the ancient Near East were not simply political centers, they were cosmological theaters, places where humans interacted with forces they believed shaped every aspect of existence. But a handful of cities went further. They attempted to integrate dangerous entities into civic life, not through worship or direct allegiance, but through a system of negotiated coexistence. These arrangements, rare, fragmentary, and difficult to interpret, suggest that some communities believed they could live alongside disruptive forces if the correct boundaries, rituals, and offerings were maintained. Here the mystery is neither a specific demon nor a particular ritual, but the architecture of fear itself, the way a city organizes space, time, and daily practice to account for presences that cannot be controlled. The first thread becomes clear when you examine administrative tablets from cities like Mari, Kish, and certain Levantine settlements that mention structures dedicated not to gods or ancestors, but to pacification or appeasement. These buildings do not appear in typical temple lists. They lack divine iconography, priestly records, or festival associations. Instead, they appear in logistical documents that track offerings of grain, oil, or incense delivered to locations whose functions are only partially explained. The wording often emphasizes keeping calm, maintaining quiet, or averting disturbance, suggesting these spaces were not devotional but preventative. They functioned as stabilizing points, interfaces where citizens believed they could neutralize forces that troubled the daily functioning of the community. The implication is profound. Instead of banishing dangerous entities, some cities sought to placate them, accepting their presence as part of the urban landscape. If these pacification structures were the only evidence, you might interpret them as an early form of social or environmental ritual. But the second thread complicates the picture by revealing that some cities identified specific locations, corners, gates, abandoned courtyards, where disturbances were believed to occur repeatedly. These problem sites appear in records that blend administrative and ritual language. They were not described as sacred, but as volatile. Building repairs, boundary renewals, and ritual interventions all converge on these spots, as if the community believed the city contained weak points, vulnerable to intrusion. What makes this especially unsettling is how consistently these sites appear across cities. Neglected alleyways, damaged thresholds, collapsed storage rooms, and old wells, places where the boundary between the built environment and the unknown seemed thin. Some scholars suggest these sites functioned as pressure valves, spaces where forces could manifest with minimal harm if acknowledged and managed correctly. Others see them as remnants of older cultic sites, repurposed under new regimes. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the ritual activity concentrated around them. As you move deeper into this pattern, a third dimension emerges from texts describing municipal rituals involving entire districts. Unlike household rites or temple ceremonies, these rituals activated whole neighborhoods. The city became a participant. Processions moved through streets at night. Torches were placed at intersections. Chants echoed along walls and rooftops. These were not celebrations or festivals. They were interventions. The goal, as inferred from fragmentary instructions, was to push disruptive forces outward, back toward the edges of the city. The ritual logic mirrored practices seen in smaller scales. Just as households protected thresholds and builders protected foundations, cities protected their perimeters. The walls were not simply military structures, they were cosmic boundaries. But what stands out most is how these rituals adapt when cities decline or expand. New boundaries required new protections. Abandoned districts required sealing. The city behaved like a living organism, maintaining its internal equilibrium. This leads naturally into the fourth thread, which raises the scholarly debate at the heart of the mystery. Were these practices directed at real entities believed to inhabit the city, or were they symbolic expressions of fear, illness, and instability? Some researchers argue the rituals reflect attempts to regulate communal anxiety in volatile political or environmental conditions. Urban life introduced disease, noise, social conflict, and pollution, forces that ancient people interpreted through supernatural frameworks. But others counter that this explanation oversimplifies the consistency of the evidence. If the practices were merely symbolic, why did they remain so stable across regions, languages, and centuries? Why do they align so closely with known demonological categories? And why do some texts describe specific presences, beings unnamed yet recognized as reasons for these interventions? The debate hinges on whether the city's efforts represent psychological strategies or literal cosmological negotiations. Neither conclusion fully accounts for the complexity of the evidence. Yet the fifth and final thread in this block reframes the question entirely. When you examine how these municipal rituals intersect with political power, a new interpretation emerges. Some rulers position themselves as mediators between their cities and the unseen forces believed to inhabit or infiltrate them. Kings and governors issued decrees reinforcing ritual practices, funded pacification structures, and sponsored boundary ceremonies. Their roles extended beyond managing taxes or enforcing laws. They became guardians of the city's cosmological integrity. This reveals a political dimension to demonology rarely acknowledged. If certain beings were thought to influence the stability of civic life, then managing them was a matter of public governance. The king's legitimacy included the capacity to maintain boundaries, not only against human enemies, but against supernatural disruptions. In this sense, demonology becomes part of urban administration, integrated into the very structure of authority. As you reflect on these threads, a larger picture forms. Cities of the ancient world did not treat demonological forces as anomalies or exceptions. They treated them as part of the environment. Just as rivers might flood or droughts might devastate crops, certain presences were believed to circulate through the city's streets, testing its boundaries. The city responded not with eradication, but with containment. Ritual cycles functioned as maintenance, a kind of spiritual engineering that reinforced the city's architecture. The inhabitants did not expect to eliminate these forces. They expected to live with them as long as the correct practices were observed. This realization echoes earlier mysteries: the desert's watchers, the funerary visitors, the beings beneath foundation stones, the symbols drifting across cultures, all reflect the broader ancient worldview in which the unseen was neither fully excluded nor fully embraced. It existed alongside human life, exerting influence, demanding negotiation. The city's rituals illustrate this coexistence on the grandest scale. Not a household, not a single rite, but an entire community adjusting its rhythms to maintain peace with forces outside its control. As this section comes to a close, the trajectory points toward an even deeper mystery. Entities whose influence was not mediated by architecture, boundaries, or ritual cycles, but by objects they were believed to inhabit. Some cities did not merely negotiate with unseen forces. They carried, stored, or sealed objects thought to hold dangerous presences within them. And the next section takes you into that realm, the world of possessed artifacts. When you step from cities negotiating with unseen forces into the realm of objects believed to carry those forces within them, the mystery takes a sharply intimate turn. A city can defend itself with walls, rituals, and boundaries, but an object small enough to hold, move, or hide, collapses that safe distance. Here the unseen is not outside the home or at the edges of the desert. It is embedded in clay, metal, stone, or wood, circulating through markets, storerooms, tombs, and households. What you begin to uncover in this section is not simply a belief in cursed artifacts, but a far older and more intricate idea that certain objects could host, trap, or retain beings, echoes, or forces long after their makers had forgotten the original meaning. This is where demonology intersects with material culture, creating one of the most layered mysteries in the ancient world. The first thread emerges in Mesopotamia, where tablets record objects described not by their function, but by the presence believed to inhabit them. These references appear scattered across administrative, ritual, and medical texts. A vessel might be labelled dangerous, a figurine watchful, a stone given voice. These descriptions do not indicate metaphor. They appear in contexts where the object is handled with precautions, wrapped in cloth, sealed in boxes, or placed inside walls. In some incantation series, practitioners warn against touching certain items unless properly purified. This suggests the ancients believed objects could absorb or retain influences from rituals, places, or events, much as a threshold could retain vulnerability or a tomb could attract watchers. The object becomes a container, not merely of physical substance, but of unseen presence. If these references were isolated, you might interpret them as poetic language or symbolic warnings. But the second thread sharpens the picture. Specific classes of objects were systematically treated as potential vessels. Ritual bowls, foundation deposits, amulets, figurines, and carved seals were all believed capable of hosting entities under particular conditions. In some cases, objects were intentionally created as containers, crafted to capture harmful forces or prevent them from spreading. In others, objects accidentally acquired presence through exposure to death, illness, conflict, or abandoned places. Scholars note an unsettling consistency in the treatment of such items. They were either hidden to prevent release or smashed to ensure the presence could not escape. The consistent use of binding formulas suggests that practitioners believed the object held not metaphorical pollution, but an active, lingering force. As you follow this trail, a third dimension surfaces when you examine objects discovered in sealed contexts, tombs, storerooms, or ritual pits, where their placement suggests fear rather than devotion. Archaeologists have uncovered jars containing tightly wrapped bundles with no apparent economic or religious purpose. Clay boxes holding figurines appear in layers beneath floors, positioned as though to prevent them from being unearthed. Metal tools believed to be tainted were buried far from habitations. The logic behind these actions is consistent across regions. Certain objects were not to be destroyed but confined. They represented a risk if allowed to circulate, so communities isolated them physically. Scholars debate whether these objects held symbolic danger or whether people believed literal entities were trapped inside. The ambiguity reveals a conceptual world where an object could become a gateway, a residue, or a cage. Yet even this pattern does not account for the most perplexing aspect of the mystery. The fourth thread introduces a scholarly debate around mute inscriptions, symbols, scratches, or marks carved onto objects with no accompanying explanation. Some appear on bowls, others on jars or tablets, and many resemble the drifting boundary marks seen in earlier sections. These inscriptions are not decorative. They occur on hidden surfaces, inside lids, beneath bases, or along narrow edges. Their placement suggests that they were made for the object itself, not for human viewers. Some scholars propose these marks were intended as instructions or restrictions for whatever presence inhabited the object. Others interpret them as warnings to future handlers. The lack of explanatory text forces researchers to confront a possibility uncomfortable in its simplicity. The mark was believed to communicate with the unseen, not with humans. This leads naturally to the fifth and most challenging thread of the block. Evidence suggesting that disparate cultures shared similar beliefs about inhabited objects, despite having no ritual or linguistic exchanges. In the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of North Africa, excavations reveal objects treated with the same containment measures found in Mesopotamia: clay figurines wrapped in cloth, jars sealed with bitumen, tools buried under thresholds, all recur with patterns too consistent for coincidence. Although scholars exercise caution when drawing parallels across cultures, the alignment of practices suggests an idea older than any individual civilization: the belief that objects exposed to certain events, death, illness, ritual failure, or boundary breaches, could become vessels for presences attracted to those conditions. These objects do not match known deity cults or ancestor rites. They occupy an intermediate category, too charged to be ordinary, too ambiguous to belong to structured demonology. As these threads accumulate, the broader mystery of possessed artifacts begins to clarify. Objects, unlike beings or places, move. They pass from hand to hand, home to home, generation to generation. Their portability introduces an element of unpredictability into demonological belief. A boundary spirit may remain at a threshold, but an inhabited artifact could be carried across regions. This mobility may explain why certain symbols drifted across cultures, why specific forms recur in distant regions, and why some beings appear in places without textual evidence of their origin. The artifact becomes a vector, a carrier of influence that outlives the rituals that first shaped it. The ancients, perhaps without articulating it explicitly, recognized this risk. Their strategies, sealing, burying, hiding, reflect a desire to localize danger, to freeze it in place by immobilizing the object. This perspective illuminates earlier mysteries: symbols that traveled without myths, demons that shifted across eras, presences that inhabited transitional spaces. In every case, The unseen attaches itself to materials, stone, clay, metal, bone, and persists long after the cultural meanings fade. The objects become silent witnesses to interactions no text records. Their survival allows forces to outlive the rituals that once managed them. What emerges from this understanding is a more dynamic view of ancient demonology. It was not confined to temples, tablets, or boundaries. It infiltrated material life. Each object carried potential. Each mark encoded memory. Each surface hinted at unseen interactions. The ancients lived surrounded by materials they believed could host presences both protective and dangerous. Their relationship to objects was not purely functional or aesthetic. It was cosmological. An artifact could be a tool, a threat, a container, or a barrier, depending on its history and context. And as this section draws to a close, you begin sensing where the trajectory leads next. If objects could contain presences, could sounds, voices, or echoes also carry traces of the unseen? The next set of mysteries unfolds not in material culture, but in the ephemeral world of sound, voices recorded in early texts that do not match the beings said to speak them, cries heard in ritual spaces where no speaker was present, and utterances that ancient scribes described as the breath of those who have no name. When you move from objects that hold presences into the domain of sound, voices with no speaker, cries with no source, utterances that fail to match the beings credited with them, you enter one of the most difficult territories in ancient demonology. Objects can be analyzed, excavated, categorized. Symbols can be traced across regions. Even shadowy beings can be inferred from context. But sound leaves nothing behind. It vanishes the moment it appears, surviving only in the words of those who claim to hear it. And yet across the ancient world, descriptions of inexplicable voices recur with enough consistency, enough technical detail, and enough ritual anxiety that they form their own category of mystery. Here the problem is not simply what spoke, but why the voice existed at all. You begin to sense that ancient people understood sound itself as a medium through which presences moved, one that could deceive, disrupt, or momentarily pierce the boundary between worlds. The first major thread becomes clear when you study cuneiform tablets describing false responses in ritual spaces. These texts refer to moments during divination or incantation ceremonies when a voice was heard but identified as belonging to no participant, assistant, priest, or supplicant. The terminology is precise. The voice is described as coming from the corner, arising behind, or speaking where none stand. Ritualists distinguished between legitimate ritual utterances, those produced through trained recitation, and these unsolicited intrusions. What stands out is the technical detail. The tablets note pitch, duration, and placement of the sound, as though attempting to categorize an auditory anomaly they could not explain. Some scholars interpret these descriptions as echoes or acoustic effects in temple architecture, but the ritual texts emphasize the voice's intentionality. It conveyed questions, warnings, or distortions during ceremonies where silence was expected. This makes the phenomenon more than an architectural quirk. It becomes an intrusion that disrupted the ritual flow. And in a culture where ritual precision determined cosmic order, such disruptions were treated with profound seriousness. Even if you attributed these false responses to acoustics, the mystery deepens with the second thread. Voices described in ancient chronicles that do not match the entities said to produce them. In several Mesopotamian and Levantine sources, beings associated with storms, illness, or nocturnal disturbances are credited with sounds that contradict their expected characteristics. A storm spirit is described as whispering. An underworld entity is said to laugh lightly. A fever demon is depicted as speaking with a voice you would mistake for a child's. These mismatches appear in contexts where scribes attempt to document the being's presence in practical detail, suggesting that they are not metaphorical flourishes but recorded observations. Scholars still debate why these descriptions diverge from iconography and ritual roles. Some argue that the voices were meant to deceive. Others believe they reflect different modes of manifestation. Yet the texts consistently highlight the unsettling discrepancy between appearance and sound. This mismatch forces you to reconsider the stability of demon forms you encountered earlier. If their visual identities shift, perhaps their vocal identities do too, making sound another unstable frontier in human attempts to classify the unseen. If the mismatch between beings and their voices were the only anomaly, you might attribute it to poetic complexity or symbolic coding. But the third thread complicates everything. Ritual spaces across the ancient world, temples, shrines, burial chambers, contain architectural features that seem designed to manage, amplify, or suppress sound in ways that correspond uncannily to the textual descriptions. Some chambers include niches or cavities that produce echoes only at specific frequencies. Others feature stone layouts that create directional sound paths. Archaeologists have documented spaces where whispers travel unusually far, where footsteps resonate unnaturally, or where a soft exhalation produces a sustaining vibration. These acoustic phenomena appear in structures associated with divination, healing, or funerary rituals, precisely the places where texts describe unsolicited voices. Scholars debate whether these features were intentional or incidental. Some argue that temple builders harnessed acoustics to create an aura of divine presence. Others believe the effects were accidental, later interpreted as supernatural, but the alignment is too precise to ignore. Architectural acoustics intersect with textual accounts in ways that blur the line between engineered ritual experience and genuine auditory anomaly. The soundscape itself becomes part of the cosmological system. Even so, if architectural design and auditory illusion explained most cases, you would expect ritual warnings to fade as construction techniques changed. Instead, the fourth and final thread reveals something more perplexing. Many texts insist that certain voices were not to be trusted under any circumstances, describing them as the breath of those who have no name. This phrase recurs in multiple languages: Akkadian, Ugaritic, Early Aramaic, with slight variations but consistent meaning. It refers to utterances unconnected to any identifiable being, sound made without form, presence, or body. Scribes warn that such voices could mislead, lure, or destabilize ritual procedure. What makes this category distinct is the emphasis on anonymity. Whereas earlier sections introduced beings defined by silence, these are defined by unclaimed sound. Their vocal presence is real, but their identity is absent. Scholars debate what the ancients meant by those who have no name. Some propose forgotten spirits, others suggest pre-cosmic remnants, still others interpret the phrase metaphorically. But the consistency across regions suggests a conceptual category that persisted even as demonological traditions shifted. As the layers of this mystery accumulate, you begin to see how ancient cultures understood sound, not just as sensory input, but as a medium of interaction. Voices could deceive, echoes could carry intention, silence could conceal presence. Sound in this worldview was not merely atmospheric, it was ontological. A voice with no speaker violated the expected order of existence. A being that spoke with the wrong voice disrupted classification, and an utterance that appeared during a ritual where no voice should be heard threatened the boundary between the human and the unseen. These disruptions required interpretation, management, and sometimes immediate ritual correction. This understanding reframes earlier mysteries. Just as objects could contain presences and symbols could drift across cultures, sound became another vector for the unseen. The uninvited funerary watchers moved silently, but their presence could be detected through subtle disturbances. The desert entities communicated through absence. The foundation spirits existed beneath the threshold of audibility. Here, sound becomes the inverse phenomenon, presence revealed not through sight, but through unexpected vocalization. And just as names fragmented and iconography shifted, voices offered clues that confounded categorization. As you move toward the close of this section, you sense the trajectory tightening. The ancient world treated sound as both evidence and threat. Ritual spaces were tuned to manage it, practitioners were trained to interpret it, Scribes recorded anomalies with meticulous care. These voices formed part of a spectrum, the same spectrum that included forbidden names, unstable iconographies, and drifting symbols. The mystery is not simply that voices were heard, but that the ancients believed some voices did not belong to any known being, and that realization leads directly into the next section, which descends from the realm of ephemeral sound to something far more physical. Bodies marked in ways that resemble demonological symbols, yet appear on individuals who had no connection to ritual practice. If sound carried traces of the unseen, the human body sometimes did as well, not metaphorically, but literally, in marks that demanded explanation. When you move from disembodied voices into the territory of bodies marked without ritual intent, the mystery becomes deeply personal. The unseen no longer speaks from temple corners or desert cliffs. It leaves traces directly on human skin. Unlike texts, symbols, or architectural acoustics, the body is intimate, immediate, and impossible to externalize. And across the ancient world, records describe markings, cuts, burns, patterns, or discolorations that mirror demonological symbols, yet appear on individuals with no known connection to ritual practice. These marks troubled ancient communities precisely because they blurred the line between internal illness and external influence. Here you encounter a class of mysteries that neither physicians nor ritual specialists could fully claim, bodily signs that resembled known protective or dangerous motifs, but emerged spontaneously, unpredictably, and often without memory of their appearance. The first thread emerges in Assyrian diagnostic texts, which categorize certain skin lesions under the label of signs that do not belong to the human. This phrasing is not poetic. It appears in medical handbooks that differentiate between natural ailments, rashes, infections, burns, and marks believed to indicate intrusion by external entities. These texts describe patterns that resemble claw-like scratches, zigzag lines, or concentric circles, motifs found in apotropaic markings and boundary symbols. The important point is that the scribes note these shapes without interpreting them as deliberate injury. Instead, they label them as arrivals, as if the skin had become a surface on which something else left a message. Practitioners attempted treatments, ointments, fumigations, incantations, but the diagnostic emphasis remained on the form of the mark, not the cause. The body became a canvas on which unseen forces might imprint themselves, intentionally or not. If these diagnostic descriptions stood alone, you might assume they reflect attempts to classify unfamiliar medical phenomena. But the second thread shifts the emphasis toward a different kind of anomaly: patterns that match protective or ritual symbols found in unrelated contexts. Archaeologists have documented cases in which the same geometric shapes that appear on figurines or boundary stones also appear carved or seemingly carved into bone, especially in burials where no ritual activity is evident. Some skeletons display healed lines that resemble ritual marks but show no signs of having been made by tools. Others show fresh patterns that correspond to motifs used in desert warnings or foundation rituals. Scholars argue intensely about whether these similarities indicate coincidence, cultural influence, or an attempt by later communities to categorize ambiguous injuries after the fact. Yet the patterns remain too consistent to dismiss easily. When the same motifs appear on stone, pottery, walls, and bodies, the idea of independent emergence strains credibility. As you examine this material more closely, the third dimension emerges through texts describing individuals who wake with marks they cannot explain. These accounts appear in administrative records, letters, and ritual prescriptions. They do not describe trance, illness, or violence. They describe people waking with geometric shapes burned or imprinted onto their skin, spirals, straight lines, branching marks. The terminology varies across languages, but the core idea remains consistent. The marks arrived in the night, during silence, or when sleep had closed the gates. These phrases mirror those used in earlier sections to describe threshold events, moments when the boundary between presence and absence weakens. Physicians often refused to treat such markings, referring the afflicted individuals to ritual specialists. Yet ritual specialists sometimes refused as well, arguing the signs did not fit any known pattern of intrusion. This ambiguity between medical and supernatural creates a conceptual vacuum. The ancients could not locate the phenomenon within existing cosmology, so the marks remained anomalous, suspended between explanation and fear. Still, if these waking accounts were the main evidence, you might conclude the phenomenon belongs to the realm of narrative exaggeration or symbolic storytelling. But the fourth thread introduces an element that pushes the discussion into deeper territory. Bodies discovered in burial contexts, with markings that appear to have been made post-mortem, possibly after burial. Some skeletons exhibit patterns that were not carved into the bone, but pressed into the tissue or skin before decomposition. The marks resemble symbols associated with boundary sealing or protection, yet appear on individuals without ritual standing. These cases primarily occur in transitional burial environments, tombs with signs of disturbance, graves sealed multiple times, or sites where funerary watchers were believed to gather. Scholars debate whether these marks reflect animal activity, post-mortem injury, or ritual tampering by later visitors. But some of the patterns, especially those involving symmetry or repetition, do not align with natural processes. They appear intentional, but no ritual tradition matches their placement or form. The fifth and final thread of this block brings the debate to its most unresolved point. Certain marks resemble demonological motifs, precisely where they should not appear. In societies with clearly defined ritual hierarchies, protective marks were placed on objects, buildings, or individuals explicitly engaged in ritual work. But the individuals with unexplained bodily markings often come from ordinary contexts: laborers, travelers, children, people with no documented connection to incantations or boundary work. Their markings show no alignment with social status, ritual function, or known medical condition. They are anomalies, appearing randomly across populations. Scholars studying these cases propose multiple explanations: psychosomatic responses to fear, accidental injuries interpreted through a demonological lens, or remnants of initiatory practices now lost. Yet none of these theories account for the specificity of the motifs, nor their occurrence across geography and time. The patterns do not scatter evenly. They cluster around liminal contexts, such as desert routes, funerary zones, abandoned structures, or architectural thresholds. As you follow these threads, a larger interpretation begins to emerge. Bodies become another kind of boundary, one neither external, like a threshold, nor conceptual, like a ritual category. The body is both interior and exterior, a space that interacts with the world through sensation, vulnerability, and presence. Ancient societies may have interpreted unexplained marks not as illness or accident, but as signs of proximity to forces they could not fully categorize. This aligns with earlier patterns. The unseen interacts with thresholds, foundations, oaths, stones, symbols, and objects. The human body, situated at the crossroads of perception and vulnerability, becomes another site of interaction, a living surface, where those interactions occasionally become visible. This perspective reframes earlier mysteries. The uninvited funerary watchers were drawn to transitional moments. Desert beings emerged, where human space dissolved into vast emptiness. Symbols drifted across cultures like residues of forgotten interactions. Voices intruded into rituals through unstable acoustics. In each case, presence revealed itself at the edge of perception. Here, that edge touches the body. The marks that appear without clear cause fit the broader ancient worldview. Forces that move through liminal zones might occasionally leave traces when those zones intersect with human experience. This understanding also explains why ancient practitioners responded to bodily marks with both fear and uncertainty. The marks did not align with established demon categories, so they could not be managed through normal incantations. They did not match known diseases, so physicians could not treat them. They represented a form of contact, unwelcome, unintelligible. and unclassifiable. Their presence forced communities to confront the limits of their cosmological systems. They were signs not of specific beings, but of destabilized boundaries. As the section closes, the trajectory begins to point toward a deeper layer of the ancient worldview. If marks on the body reflect contact with forces that move across thresholds, then what about marks that appear without contact at all? Symbols etched in places no human hand touched. The next section takes you into the realm of inscriptions that seem older than the surfaces they appear on, lines that challenge archaeology's linear timelines, and marks found in contexts where no known culture should have carved them. Here, the mystery is not the body, but the world itself bearing signs whose origins defy explanation. The moment you shift from marks on the human body to marks on the world itself, the mystery widens far beyond individual experience. Bodies move, decay, and disappear. Landscapes persist, and yet across deserts, cliffs, ruined cities, and cave walls, archaeologists have found inscriptions, carvings, and symbols whose placement or age contradict every expectation of cultural continuity. These are not the well-preserved texts of known scribes, nor the deliberate markings of established ritual practice. They are anomalous inscriptions, lines that seem older than the surfaces they rest upon, motifs that appear in regions with no known symbolic tradition to match them, or marks that align with demonological signs, yet appear in contexts where no ritual system should have produced them. Here, the mystery becomes geological as much as cultural. You are no longer tracking human behavior alone. You are following a trail of symbols that behave as if they belong to no single era, no single people, and no single interpretation. You first notice this pattern when examining inscriptions carved into rock faces, whose surfaces show far more erosion than the markings themselves. Archaeologists typically date petroglyphs by studying the weathering of the rock in relation to the depth and freshness of the carved line. Yet in several regions of the Levant, northern Arabia, and parts of Anatolia, the lines appear younger than the rock they cut into, yet older than any cultural layer that should have produced them. This is the first major fact in this block. Symbols that appear temporally dislocated, older or younger than their environmental context, in ways that resist linguistic or stylistic categorization. Scholars debate whether the seeming discrepancy reflects unusual weather patterns, mineral variations, or later recarving, but in several cases the inscriptions show no signs of layering. They appear as single actions cut into surfaces, much older than the marks themselves, and some of these symbols match patterns seen in protective or dangerous motifs, zigzags, branching lines, circles enclosing dots, raising questions about how such symbols reached regions with no corresponding textual traditions. If the temporal mismatch were the only anomaly, you might attribute it to misinterpretation or geological complexity. But the second thread amplifies the mystery. Some carvings appear in locations where human access would have been nearly impossible at the time the surrounding strata were formed. In several cliffside sites, symbols appear dozens of meters above the highest ancient footpaths, positioned on sheer surfaces requiring equipment no known Bronze or Iron Age culture possessed. The marks show no evidence of ropes, scaffolding, or platform construction. They are simply there, precise, deliberate, and highly consistent. Archaeologists sometimes describe these locations as non-access zones, spaces where ritual carving is not just unlikely, but impractical. Yet the symbols match demonological motifs associated with boundaries or dangerous crossings. This suggests two unsettling possibilities. Either the symbols were carved when the geology was different, before erosion elevated the surfaces, or they were carved later through means that left no archaeological trace. Neither hypothesis aligns cleanly with known cultural activity, and the consistent alignment of these inaccessible symbols with concepts of danger or intrusion deepens the puzzle. Even if you accepted these inaccessible carvings as unusual but explainable anomalies, the third dimension disrupts any simple narrative. Some inscriptions replicate motifs from regions thousands of kilometers away, despite having no historical contact. Here is the third major fact of this block: symbol sets appearing across vast distances with too much precision to be dismissed as coincidence. Scholars studying these parallels caution against sensationalism, noting that geometric convergence can occur naturally, but in many cases the parallels exceed generic similarity. The same unusual proportion between lines, the same recursive loops, the same asymmetrical spirals recur in regions whose archaeological layers show no evidence of cultural exchange. These symbols appear in context associated with danger, thresholds, or liminal environments, cave mouths, canyon edges, and abandoned shrines. The convergence challenges both diffusion theories and independent invention models. Either ancient travelers carried these motifs across enormous distances without leaving textual or material traces of their movement, or the symbols emerged independently through mechanisms scholars have yet to understand. But if these parallels were merely evidence of forgotten exchanges or shared human psychology, the final thread complicates the matter further by introducing inscriptions whose meanings remain deeply contested. This fourth and final fact in the block concerns marks that do not correspond to any known writing system, symbolic code, or decorative motif, yet appear in ritual or liminal settings. Archaeologists classify them as proto-symbolic, non-linguistic, or unassigned markings. They are not letters, there is no phonetic structure. They are not numbers, their repetition lacks numerical pattern. They are not decorative. Many appear in locations invisible to casual observers. Some resemble scratches or gouges, but their symmetry and consistency suggest intentional crafting. Scholars disagree on whether these marks represent forgotten rituals, private codes, or attempts to record encounters now vanished from cultural memory. A few propose that the marks served as apotropaic barriers meant to prevent intrusion from forces that disturbed boundaries. Others argue they were warnings left by travelers who encountered something unusual. The debate remains open, with no consensus emerging across disciplines. What matters is that these marks behave like residues of interactions that do not fit any known system of ancient communication. As you synthesize these anomalies, a new image of ancient cosmology takes shape. The world itself becomes a surface on which interactions with the unseen occasionally left physical traces. Just as bodies could bear marks from unknown forces, landscapes could hold inscriptions reflecting encounters beyond recorded ritual. The ancients lived in a world where boundaries were fragile, between life and death, between city and wilderness, between the known and the unknown. In such a worldview, it makes sense that certain places would become inscribed not only by human hands, but by events interpreted through supernatural frameworks. The inscriptions may not record the presence of beings directly, but they hint at disturbances, moments when the ordinary order of things faltered and symbols emerged as attempts to regain control. This perspective connects the mysterious inscriptions to earlier themes, drifting apotropaic motifs across cultures, ritual marks placed on unseen surfaces, symbols carved where they were never meant to be seen. The inscriptions in this section function like echoes, tokens of interactions whose original context is lost. They align with the ancient understanding of the world as permeated by forces both natural and supernatural, and they illustrate how deeply ancient societies relied on marks, symbols, and surfaces to negotiate with the unseen. As this section concludes, the trajectory pulls you toward an even more enigmatic frontier. If symbols can appear where no culture should have carved them, and if marks can predate the layers they rest upon, then what happens when the lines between supernatural entities themselves begin to blur? The next chapter moves from inscriptions into the realm of beings whose identities were so unstable that even the ancients could not determine whether they were protectors, predators, or simply echoes of something older. Beings that resisted every attempt to categorize them, appearing in records only as contradictions. When you step from inscriptions carved in impossible places into the realm of beings who defy all attempts at identification, the mystery compresses into something sharper and far more elusive. Earlier sections traced entities defined by location, function, or context. Threshold watchers, funerary observers, desert presences, foundation guardians. But here you confront beings whose identities remain unstable, even within the texts that mention them. They appear in contradictory roles, shifting from protective to harmful, from bound to free, from visible to invisible, sometimes within the same paragraph of a single ancient tablet. These are not merely ambiguous figures or misunderstood symbols. They occupy a category of their own, entities that seem to blur the conceptual boundaries between demon, guardian, remnant, and echo. Their instability is not accidental, it is defining, and that instability becomes the core of this section's mystery. The first thread becomes clear when examining Mesopotamian ritual texts, where certain beings are described using mutually incompatible traits. A single entry may list an entity as one who guards the threshold, then a few lines later as one who troubles the house, followed by a note marking the same being as a bringer of quiet when invoked. These descriptions do not refer to different figures sharing a name. Scribes explicitly treat them as the same presence. The contradictions are not editorial errors. The passages integrate them seamlessly, as though expecting the reader to accept that the being could occupy multiple roles simultaneously. This is the first major fact of this block. Some entities were believed to embody contradictory qualities, rather than shifting between them. Ancient scribes did not attempt to reconcile the paradox, they documented it. To them, the instability was intrinsic, a sign that the being operated beyond the human categories of harmful, helpful, or neutral. If this were an isolated phenomenon confined to a small number of texts, you might interpret it as the result of overlapping local traditions. But the second thread reveals that such contradictions appear across multiple genres, incantations, medical texts, omen series, and even administrative records. A being listed as a protector of children in one tablet may reappear as a bringer of fever in another. In some cases, the same entity functions as an apotropaic guardian in household rituals, while appearing as a malevolent intruder in dream omens. Scholars once argued that scribes conflated multiple regional spirits into one composite figure, but that explanation falters when the same paradoxical traits appear across widely separated sites and centuries. Instead, the pattern suggests a conceptual category in which identity is fluid, not fixed. These beings had roles that shifted depending on context, location, time of day, ritual state, or the vulnerability of those encountering them. The ancients recognized this fluidity and described it without attempting to standardize it. Even so, you might still conclude that the confusion reflects the fragmentary nature of surviving sources. But the third thread disrupts that assumption entirely. Some beings' contradictory roles are explicitly highlighted in ancient commentary, where scribes note that a given figure's nature is not one thing or changeable by appearance. These remarks occur in explanatory notes added to ritual tablets, where the scribe clarifies points that novices might misunderstand. In these notes, the identity instability is intentional, not accidental. The being is said to take multiple forms, behave differently depending on who encounters it, or even shift allegiance between protective and harmful functions. The commentary does not treat this as a flaw in ritual logic, it treats it as an essential characteristic. This suggests the ancients conceptualized certain beings as fluctuating forces rather than fixed personalities, entities defined by conditions, not by essence. Their instability mirrored the unpredictable nature of illness, weather, dreams, or social disorder. Yet even this recognition fails to capture the deepest layer of the mystery. The fourth thread reveals beings whose contradictions cross not only roles, but cosmological boundaries. Some figures appear associated with both upper world and underworld domains, as though inhabiting multiple cosmological layers simultaneously. In one text, a being may be invoked to escort harmful spirits downward. In another, it is described as emerging from below to trouble the living. In several cases, these same entities appear in rituals that require them to act as intermediaries between divine and human realms, yet also in omens, predicting misfortune if they are seen or sensed. Scholars debate whether these contradictions reflect attempts to integrate older regional spirits into new cosmological frameworks, but the abruptness of the shifts and the consistency of the contradictions suggest more than syncretism. They reveal a conceptual space in which certain beings operate across the boundaries humans imposed on the supernatural. These entities act as connectors between layers of the cosmos, occupying multiple positions at once. This leads directly into the fifth and final thread in the block. Beings described as echoes, remnants, or those who persist after their reason is forgotten. These terms appear sparsely, almost reluctantly, in texts that attempt to classify entities whose origins were unknown even to the ancients. Scribes sometimes describe them as fragments of older beings, or as the lingering effects of rituals no longer practiced. They carry traits associated with multiple categories. They can disturb sleep like dream demons, guard boundaries like threshold spirits, and carry illness like malevolent winds. Yet they belong to none of those categories fully. They move through the spaces between systems, surfacing in moments of instability. In some cases, rituals instruct practitioners not to banish such beings, but to redirect or delay them, implying that they are too deeply woven into the fabric of the world to be removed. Their persistence is not tied to belief or worship, it is tied to the structure of reality as the ancients understood it. These echo beings reflect the idea that forces can outlast the cosmologies that once explained them. As you consider these threads together, a broader realization emerges. Ancient demonology was not a closed taxonomy. It was a dynamic system shaped by instability and adaptation. Some beings were defined by their contradictions: guardians who harmed, intruders who protected, remnants that refused classification. Their instability challenges the modern desire to categorize, label, and separate. But for the ancients, instability was not a flaw. It was a characteristic of certain kinds of presence. The world was full of forces whose behavior depended not only on their identity, but on context, timing, and the condition of the human who encountered them. The beings in this section embody that worldview. They defy singular interpretation, appearing as flux rather than form. This understanding reframes earlier mysteries: the drifting symbols, the evolving iconographies, the ambiguous inscriptions, the marks on bodies, the voices with no source, all point to a cosmological model where the unseen operates through patterns, influences, and conditions rather than stable entities. The beings in this section represent the pinnacle of that model. They are the ancient acknowledgement that some forces cannot be tamed or categorized, that presence can be fluid, and that identity itself can be unstable. As this section comes to an end, the narrative prepares for its final descent. If some beings exist as contradictions, what then of the entities that appear only at the end of cycles, creatures mentioned exclusively during collapse, abandonment, or the dissolution of social order? The final section explores those figures, presences that emerge only when a world is ending, and whose appearances mark the closing of ancient eras. When you move from beings defined by contradiction into the final frontier of ancient demonology, the presences that appear only at endings, you reach a territory the ancients treated with extraordinary caution. These entities do not inhabit thresholds, deserts, funerary spaces, or bodies. They do not drift across cultures as symbols, or shift roles across centuries, or lurk beneath foundations, or whisper from temple corners. Instead, they surface only during collapse, the fall of a city, the abandonment of a settlement, the extinguishing of a dynasty, or the unraveling of a ritual system. They are not harbingers of destruction so much as symptoms of it, entities whose arrival marks the end of an era and whose presence is recorded only when things have already gone wrong. This final chapter uncovers beings the ancients described with a chilling consistency. They appear when order dissolves, when boundaries fail, and when the world itself enters a liminal state too large for ordinary rituals to control. The first thread emerges from the destruction layers of cities like Ibla, Ugarit, and Hattusa, where tablets record unusual ritual activity in the final years before collapse. These texts describe night disturbances, wandering presences, and voices that do not match the world. The wording differs across languages, but the pattern is unmistakable. Scribes documented phenomena that did not appear in earlier periods of stability. These presences were not blamed for the destruction, war, famine, or political turmoil caused that, but their appearance seems to have been interpreted as a symptom of a world out of balance. The beings appear only when society falters, as though drawn to cracks in the cosmic structure. This is the first major fact of the block. Collapse-era records consistently reference anomalous presences that do not fit existing supernatural categories. If these references were isolated to highly literate city-states, you might attribute them to elite anxiety. But the second thread expands the scope dramatically. Lesser-known settlements with minimal scribal tradition also reveal traces of collapse-associated entities, though expressed in simpler forms. In abandoned villages across the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of Mesopotamia, archaeologists find hastily placed apotropaic symbols carved over doorways or on boundary stones. These symbols differ from the protective motifs used during normal ritual practice. They are rougher, more urgent, and often repeated in patterns suggesting fear rather than ceremony. The repetition indicates that communities perceived a different kind of threat, one not associated with illness, thresholds, or desert beings, but with the dissolution of daily life. These markings appear in the final occupational layers, before abandonment, aligning with periods of food shortage, conflict, or demographic collapse. They hint at forces believed to emerge when the normal structure of society failed. The third thread introduces a category of beings mentioned only in esoteric ritual texts, reserved for crisis situations. Entities called the unmoored, the ones who arrive after the bonds break, or those who wait for silence. These beings do not appear in everyday demonological lists. They are invoked only in rituals meant to stabilize cities during trauma, earthquakes, invasions, or prolonged instability. The descriptions are sparse but striking. They are said to hover at the edges of settlements, to gather in abandoned streets, or to linger near extinguished hearths. They do not attack or interact directly. They simply appear when the structures that normally maintain cosmic and social order collapse. Scholars debate whether these beings were metaphors for fear, hunger, or despair, but the rituals treat them as literal presences. Their defining trait is not malevolence, but opportunism. They move into spaces vacated by order. Their presence signals that the city has entered a liminal state too expansive for ordinary rituals to repair. If this were the full extent of the evidence, you might interpret these crisis entities as symbolic personifications of societal decline. But the fourth thread brings in a dimension that resists such simplicity, references to beings that appear only once in the entire textual record, in tablets written during a city's final year or even final month. These singular entries describe shadows that do not match the living, voices heard after the hearth is cold, or those who pass when the gate no longer stands. What makes these references so haunting is that they vanish from the record immediately afterward. No subsequent culture incorporates them into its demonology. No later ritual invokes or banishes them. They appear once, exactly once, and then disappear forever. Scholars propose that these beings were hyper-local phenomena reflecting extreme cultural trauma. Others argue that the beings represent the fragmentary remnants of older cosmologies, resurfacing during crisis. But the fact that some of these descriptions align across cities that fell centuries apart suggests a deeper pattern. Collapse reveals beings normally hidden by the structure of ordered life. This leads directly into the fifth and final thread, beings associated with post-collapse silence. Archaeologists studying abandoned cities often find ritual deposits placed after the final occupation layer, offerings or marks made by people who returned briefly to the ruins. These deposits sometimes include figurines, boundary symbols, or scratched marks resembling demonological motifs. Some are accompanied by inscriptions referring to those who stayed behind or the ones who remain when the world has ended here. These phrases do not describe ghosts or ancestors. They describe presences that move into abandoned spaces once human activity ceases. In some cases, the offerings appear designed not to summon or banish, but to acknowledge the presences, perhaps as a gesture of respect, fear, or resignation. The implication is profound. The ancients believed that when a city dies, something else takes its place, not in a conquering sense, but in an occupying one. These beings fill the void left by human departure, inhabiting the silence that follows. When you synthesize these threads, a larger, more unsettling picture emerges. Ancient cosmology does not imagine the world as filled with stable beings, waiting to interact with humans. Instead, the unseen adapts to conditions, appearing in thresholds, deserts, funerals, foundations, or collapsing cities, depending on context. The collapse-only entities represent the extreme edge of this worldview. They are presences that require absence, forces that manifest only when the structures that define human order break down. They are not destroyers, they are inheritors. Their arrival signals not malice but transition, the movement from one world state into another. This perspective reframes earlier mysteries, the watchers drawn to funerary liminality, the desert presences that emerge in emptiness, the unstable beings that shift roles, the inscriptions that appear in uninhabited places. The unseen does not exist outside the world. It exists in the world's gaps. Collapse creates the largest gap of all, and these beings fill it. And as you reach the final words of this exploration, the arc of ancient demonology becomes clear. The ancients did not construct a system of monsters. They constructed a system of boundaries between life and death, order and chaos, presence and absence. Every mystery you have traced reflects one truth. The unseen moves where structure weakens. The final beings, those that appear only at endings, are the ultimate expression of that truth. They arrive not to destroy, but because the world has opened